In this video, we explore the Sabbatean-Frankist Sect, one of the most controversial religious movements in history. This group has often been associated with sin, transgression, the breaking of laws, and unusual religious practices. They are frequently described as a secretive community that embedded itself within surrounding societies, outwardly appearing as Muslims or Christians, while secretly following the teachings of their own Sabbatean tradition. According to accounts from both critics and observers, this outward conformity was not merely a survival strategy, but was sometimes understood by followers as part of fulfilling the deeper aims of their religious worldview. Some claims even suggest that remnants of this sect still exist today, and that they secretly rule the world. The scholarly literature on this movement is relatively limited, which made deciding how to approach this topic somewhat difficult when preparing this video. At first, I considered focusing mainly on the philosophical and theological ideas of the movement, while including only a small amount of historical background. However, it soon became clear that this approach would not work very well. Most of the existing research on the Sabbatean and Frankist movements concentrates heavily on their historical development, while their religious beliefs and practices are often mentioned only briefly within that historical framework. Because of this, separating the religious dimension from the historical narrative is extremely difficult. Although it is technically possible to discuss the religious ideas of the movement on their own, doing so without the historical context would likely make the subject confusing. The beliefs and practices of the sect developed directly out of specific historical circumstances, and understanding those events helps explain why their theology took the form that it did. For that reason, I decided to combine both history and religion in this presentation. The first part of the video focuses mainly on the historical development of the movement, while also introducing some of its religious themes. The second half, which appears after the exploration of the Frankist sect, concentrates much more directly on the religious and philosophical ideas. By the time you reach that second section, the earlier historical discussion will hopefully provide the background needed to understand how those religious concepts emerged and how they were interpreted by their followers. Most of the information used in this video comes from the works of Gershom Scholem, along with several additional secondary sources. It is worth noting that some believe that certain elements of Scholem's theory on the development of the Sabbatean movement are controversial. At the same time, he is widely regarded as one of the most important scholars in the study of Jewish religion and philosophy, especially in the fields of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Because of his deep engagement with these subjects, his research remains one of the most influential sources for understanding the Sabbatean tradition. Sabbatai Zevi was born in the Ottoman city of Smyrna, reportedly on Tisha B'Av, one of Judaism's traditional fast days, during the period known as the 3 weeks, in the year 1626. In Hebrew, the name Sabbatai refers to Saturn. Within Jewish tradition, the reign of Sabbatai, associated with the highest planet, was often connected with expectations surrounding the arrival of the Messiah. Zevi's family belonged to the Romaniote Jewish community and originally came from Patras. His father, Mordecai, worked as a poultry merchant in the region of the Morea. During the Ottoman-Venetian Wars, Smyrna developed into an important center of Levantine trade, and Mordecai eventually became the Smyrna representative of an English trading house, gaining a degree of prosperity through this position. Sabbatai's sister, Ora Gadol, was herself an educated woman and was respected among the Jewish community of Smyrna for her learning. In accordance with the common Jewish custom of the time, Sabbatai's father arranged for him to study the Talmud. He attended a yeshiva led by the chief rabbi of Smyrna, Joseph Eskopa. Although formal studies in halakha, or Jewish law, did not strongly attract him, Zevi nevertheless became skilled in Talmudic learning. At the same time, he developed a deep interest in mysticism and Kabbalah and was influenced by the teachings of Isaac Luria. Practical Kabbalah, whose followers practiced forms of asceticism in order to communicate with God and angels, foresee future events, and perform miraculous acts, held particular fascination for him. In addition to studying the writings of Luria, he read the Zohar and practiced ascetic disciplines and Kabbalistic purification rituals known as tikkunim. As his knowledge of Kabbalistic learning grew, he attracted a number of young contemporaries who gathered around him to study. Between the years 1642 and 1648, he lived in a state of partial seclusion. During this time, he began to display a pattern of behavior that corresponds closely to what modern psychiatric descriptions identify as a severe form of cyclothymia or manic depressive psychosis. Periods of deep depression and melancholy alternated with episodes of intense excitement and euphoria, separated by intervals in which his mental state appeared relatively normal. These fluctuations, which are well documented throughout his life, continued until his death. In later interpretations by his followers, these states were not explained in psychological terms, but rather in theological language. They were described as moments of illumination, followed by fall, or by the hiding of the face, referring to the state in which God conceals his presence. This condition brought forward a decisive element of his personality. During his moments of illumination, he felt driven to perform actions that violated religious law. These acts were later called strange or paradoxical actions. Their specific form varied over time, yet they consistently involved unusual rituals and abrupt innovations. One feature remained constant during these periods of exaltation: his tendency to pronounce the ineffable name of God, the sacred four-letter name. In the periods of melancholy, which differed in length, he withdrew from human contact and lived in isolation, believing that he was struggling against demonic forces that attacked and partially overwhelmed him. The precise moment when this illness first appeared cannot be determined with certainty. At the latest, however, it had manifested itself by the year 1648, when news of the Chmielniki massacres reached Smyrna. During the first half of the 17th century, ideas about the approaching Messianic age were widespread. Many believed that the redemption of the Jewish people and their return to the land of Israel with independent sovereignty were near. Christian writers also identified the year 1666 as an apocalyptic moment, and millenarian beliefs were especially common in England. The expectation was so widespread that Manasseh ben Israel, in a letter addressed to Oliver Cromwell and the Rump Parliament, referred to these shared expectations when urging the readmission of Jews into England, stating that many Christians and he himself believed that the time when the Jewish nation would be restored to its homeland was very close. Because Sabbatai's father worked as the representative of an English trading company in Smyrna, he likely maintained business connections with English merchants. Through these contacts, Sabbatai may have learned something about Western millennial expectations within his own household. Historians continue to debate how much influence English and Dutch Calvinist millenarian thought had on the Messianic movement that later formed around Zevi. Alongside these broader expectations about the Messiah, there was also a specific calculation derived from a passage in the Zohar, the well-known Jewish mystical text, which suggested that the Israelites would be redeemed by the long-awaited Jewish Messiah in the year 1648. In the year 1648, Sabbatai announced to his followers in Smyrna that he was the promised Messianic Redeemer. In order to demonstrate this claim, he began publicly pronouncing the Tetragrammaton, the sacred name of God, an act traditionally forbidden to everyone except the high priest of Israel, who alone was permitted to utter it in the temple in Jerusalem on Yom Kippur. Because the temple had been destroyed during the siege of Jerusalem in the year 70 of the Common Era, this act carried deep symbolic meaning. Because he was already known to suffer from mental instability, these claims were not taken seriously, and his conduct produced little more than temporary disturbance. In many cases, his eccentric behavior aroused sympathy rather than hostility. Sabbatai also declared that he possessed the ability to fly, although he told his followers that he could not display this publicly because they were not worthy enough to witness it. Between the years 1646 and 1650, he entered into 2 marriages in Smyrna. Since neither marriage was consummated, both eventually ended in divorce. Within his native city, he was regarded partly as a madman and partly as a foolish eccentric. Yet he possessed an attractive appearance and was highly musical, with an exceptionally beautiful singing voice. For this reason he succeeded in forming friendships, although he did not gain followers for his Kabbalistic speculations. He likewise claimed to experience visions of God. During these years, he began to speak about a particular mystery of the Godhead that he believed had been revealed to him through his inner struggles. He frequently referred to the God of his faith, with whom he felt a unique and intimate connection. It remains uncertain whether he understood this to refer specifically to the divine attribute known as Tiferet, which he regarded as the principal manifestation of God, or whether he had in mind some higher power that clothed itself in that attribute. In any case, the expression, the God of Israel, acquired for him a special mystical meaning. His recurring impulse to violate the law during his illuminated states, sometimes accompanied by imagined experiences of levitation, together with his repeated declarations that he was the Messiah, eventually compelled the rabbis of Smyrna to intervene. Zevi first revealed his claim to being the Messiah to Isaac Silveira and Moses Pinheiro, the latter being the grandfather of the Italian rabbi Joseph Ergas. However, at the age of 22, Sabbatai was still too young to be recognized as an established rabbinic authority, and his influence within the local community remained limited. Although he had lived a devout and ascetic life as a mystic in Smyrna for several years, the older and more established rabbinic leadership viewed his behavior with suspicion. The local college of rabbis, led by his former teacher Joseph Escopa, kept a close watch on him. When his messianic claims became too bold, he and his followers were placed under a decree of herem, a form of excommunication within Judaism. Around the year 1651, or possibly a few years later, the rabbis expelled Sabbatai and his disciples from Smyrna. The exact course of his travels afterward is uncertain, but by the year 1658 he had appeared in Constantinople. There he encountered a preacher named Abraham Yachini, a disciple of the Talmudic scholar Joseph Troni, who affirmed Sabbatai's messianic mission. Yachini is said to have produced a manuscript written in archaic characters that supported Sabbatai's claim to be the Messiah. The document was called The Great Wisdom of Solomon and began with a dramatic declaration. According to the text, Abraham stated that he had been confined within a cave for 40 years and wondered why the time of miracles had not yet arrived. Then, he wrote, a voice was heard announcing that a son would be born in the Hebrew year 5386 to Mordecai Zevi, and that the child would be named Sabbatai. This child, the voice proclaimed, would humble the great dragon and would be the true Messiah who would sit upon the divine throne. Armed with this document, Sabbatai selected Salonika as the center of his activities. At that time, the city was an important place for discussions of Kabbalah and mystical learning. There he openly proclaimed himself to be the Messiah, the long-awaited, anointed one, and began attracting many followers by arranging a series of unusual mystical gatherings. Among these acts, he held a symbolic ceremony in which he celebrated a marriage to the Torah, referring to it as the One Without End, the Ein Sof. He also organized a solemn festival and invited his companions to attend. Despite the enthusiasm of his followers, the rabbinic authorities of Salonika, led by Abraham de Botone, eventually expelled him from the city. Accounts of his movements afterward differ. Various sources suggest that he may have spent time in several cities, including Alexandria, Athens, Constantinople, Jerusalem, and Smyrna, using them as temporary bases. Eventually he established himself in Cairo, where he remained for roughly 2 years, from the beginning of the 1660s until the early part of that decade's middle years. While living in Cairo, Sabbatai formed a close friendship with Raphael Joseph Halaby, a wealthy and influential member of the Jewish community who held the important Ottoman post of mintmaster as well as the role of tax farmer. Despite his high position and wealth, Raphael Joseph lived an austere and disciplined life. His practices included frequent fasting, bathing in cold water, and even scourging himself during the night. Much of his considerable fortune was devoted to charitable works. He supported poor scholars devoted to the Talmud and Kabbalah, and it was said that about 50 such students regularly ate at his table. Halaby soon became both a supporter and an active promoter of Sabbatai's claim to be the Messiah. Around the year 1663, Sabbatai traveled to Jerusalem. There he returned to the severe ascetic habits he had practiced earlier, engaging in frequent fasts and other forms of penance. Many observers regarded these actions as evidence of exceptional religious devotion. When he sang psalms throughout the night, he drew large audiences, At other times he performed Spanish love songs, which he interpreted in a mystical and symbolic manner. He also spent time praying and weeping at the graves of revered men and women, and he sometimes distributed sweets to children in the streets. Over time, these behaviors helped him gather an ever larger group of followers. During this period, the Jewish community in Jerusalem was struggling with serious financial difficulties. Heavy taxes imposed by the Ottoman authorities had created a desperate need for funds. Because Sabbatai was known to be connected with the wealthy and influential Raphael Joseph Halaby, he was chosen to travel to Cairo and appeal to him for assistance. His success in obtaining the money necessary to meet the Ottoman demands greatly increased his reputation. Many of his supporters later considered this journey to Cairo as the true beginning of his public career. Another important event that occurred during his later stay in Cairo further strengthened Sabbatai's reputation among many Jews. During the violent upheaval in Poland known as the Khmelnytsky Uprising, a young Jewish girl named Sarah had been left orphaned. Christians found her and placed her in a convent where she remained for many years. After about a decade, when she was roughly 16 years old, she escaped, claiming that her deliverance had been miraculous, and eventually made her way to Amsterdam. From there she traveled to Livorno. Reports circulating at the time suggested that she lived a troubled life, including involvement in prostitution, yet she also believed firmly that she would one day become the bride of the Messiah, whose arrival many people thought was approaching. When news of her story reached Cairo, Sabbatai declared that he had once been promised such a companion in a dream, explaining that the Messiah was destined to fall in love with a woman who had been unchaste. According to the reports, he sent messengers to Livorno to bring Sarah to him, and the two were eventually married in the house of Raphael Joseph Halaby. Sarah's beauty and her unusual personality were said to have attracted additional followers to Sabbatai. Through her presence, a more romantic and even scandalous element entered his story. Supporters of Sabbatai interpreted the transformation of her life as another confirmation of his messianic mission, comparing it to the biblical account of the prophet Hosea, who had been commanded to take a wife of whoredom as the first symbolic act of his prophetic calling. With the financial and political support of Halaby, along with a charming wife and a growing number of devoted followers, Sabbatai returned to Jerusalem in a triumphant manner. While traveling, he passed through the city of Gaza, which at that time possessed an important Jewish community. There he encountered Nathan Benjamin Levi, later widely known as Nathan of Gaza. Nathan soon became deeply involved in Sabbatai's messianic mission, acting as his closest associate and trusted supporter. He proclaimed himself to be the returned prophet Elijah, who, according to tradition, was destined to announce the coming of the Messiah. In the year 1665, Nathan declared that the Messianic age would begin in the following year, when the world would be conquered peacefully and without bloodshed. According to this prophecy, the Messiah would gather the 10 lost tribes and lead them back to the Holy Land while riding on a lion with a 7-headed dragon in its jaws. The rabbis of Jerusalem looked upon Sabbatai's movement with deep suspicion and warned that those who followed him might face excommunication. Realizing that Jerusalem was not the most suitable place to continue his plans, Sabbatai departed and returned toward his native city of Smyrna. Nathan announced that from that point onward Gaza, rather than Jerusalem, would be considered the sacred center. During his journey from Jerusalem to Smyrna, Sabbatai received an enthusiastic welcome in the city of Aleppo. When he finally reached Smyrna in the autumn of 1665, he was received with great honor. After a brief period of hesitation, he publicly declared himself to be the long-expected Messiah during the festival of Rosh Hashanah that same year. His proclamation took place in the synagogue, accompanied by the sounding of shofars and loud cries of "Long live our King, our Messiah." From that moment his followers began referring to him by the title Amira, a Hebrew acronym meaning, "Our Lord and King, may His Majesty be exalted." With the support of his wife, Sabbatai assumed leadership of the community and used his influence to suppress opposition. He removed the existing rabbi of Smyrna, Aaron Lapapa, from his position and replaced him with Chaim Benvenisti. Meanwhile, his movement was spreading across Europe. Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands became important centers of enthusiasm for his claims, and the Jewish communities of Hamburg and Amsterdam learned of the dramatic events unfolding in Smyrna through reports carried by Christians. Henry Oldenburg, a German scholar who served as the first secretary of the Royal Society, even wrote to Baruch Spinoza that everyone around him was discussing rumors that the Israelites were returning to their own land, adding that if such news proved true it might bring about a revolution in the affairs of the world. Among Sabbatai supporters were many well-known rabbis and scholars, including Isaac Aboab de Fonseca, Moses Raphael de Aguilar, Moshe ben Yonatan Galanti, Moses ben Mordecai Zacuto, and Chaim ben Venisti. Benjamin Musafia, who had once been associated with Spinoza, also joined the movement. At the same time, remarkable and often fantastic stories began to circulate and were widely believed. One report claimed that in the far north of Scotland a ship had appeared with sails and ropes made of silk, crewed by sailors who spoke Hebrew, and flying a banner bearing the words, "The 12 Tribes of Israel." Inspired by such stories, the Jewish community of Avignon in France even began preparing to migrate to the expected new kingdom in the spring of the following year. The willingness of many Jews to accept Sabbatai Zevi's messianic claims can largely be understood in light of the desperate situation faced by European Jewry during the middle of the 17th century. The brutal massacres that accompanied the Khmelnytsky uprising had devastated Jewish communities across Eastern Europe, destroying many centers of learning and communal life and killing many thousands of Jews. Against this background of suffering and uncertainty, hopes for redemption grew stronger. With Sabbatai's apparent approval, some of his followers began proposing the abolition of many elements of halakha, the traditional system of Jewish law, in what was essentially an act of antinomianism. Antinomianism means anti-law, or against the law. These ideas even extended to certain commandments, since a minority opinion in the Talmud held that in the Messianic age such obligations would no longer be necessary. One example of this shift was the fast of the 10th of Tevet, which was transformed into a day of celebration and rejoicing. Other scholars, however, have argued that Sabbatai himself did not intend to abolish the whole structure of halakha, but only sought to adjust particular practices, each change being supported with a halakhic justification. Samuel Primo, who became Sabbatai's secretary when he arrived in Smyrna, distributed a circular letter to Jewish communities in the name of the Messiah. In it, Sabbatai was described as the Messiah and Redeemer of Israel, and the message declared that the people had lived long enough in sorrow. According to the letter, their mourning should now be turned into joy and their fasting into celebration, because the promised time had arrived and the Messiah had appeared among them. This message caused considerable controversy. Many people considered it blasphemous, especially because Sabbatai encouraged celebration on his own birthday, instead of observing the solemn day of mourning known as Tisha B'Av. The reaction produced anger and division within many Jewish communities. Even some leaders who had initially sympathized with the movement were shocked by such radical innovations. Solomon Nissim al-Ghazi, a respected Talmudic scholar of Smyrna, together with other members of the rabbinic leadership who opposed the abolition of the fast, barely escaped being killed by Sabbatai's more extreme supporters. At the beginning of the year 1666, Sabbatai departed from Smyrna and traveled toward Constantinople, possibly because local authorities compelled him to leave the city. Nathan of Gaza had earlier predicted that once Sabbatai reached Constantinople, he would place the Sultan's crown upon his own head. Concerned about such claims, the Grand Vizier, Koprialuzaid Fazl Ahmed Pasha, ordered that Sabbatai be arrested immediately and placed in prison, perhaps in order to demonstrate clearly that the authority of the Sultanate remained unquestioned. Yet his imprisonment did not weaken the devotion of his followers. In fact, he was treated relatively well during his confinement, likely because of bribes given by supporters, and this comfortable treatment only strengthened the belief of his adherents in his special status. Meanwhile, Nathan of Gaza, Abraham Yakini, and others circulated stories describing the Messiah's supposed miraculous actions in the Ottoman capital, and anticipation within the Jewish diaspora continued to grow. After about 2 months of imprisonment in Constantinople, Sabbatai was transferred to the castle prison at Abydos on the Hellespont, accompanied by several of his companions. His followers began referring to this fortress as Migdal Oz, meaning Tower of Strength. Sabbatai arrived there on the day before Passover. At that time he slaughtered a paschal lamb for himself and his followers, and ate it together with its fat, an act that violated the rules of Halakha. Over the meal he is said to have pronounced the blessing, "Blessed be God who has restored that which was forbidden." The large sums of money sent by wealthy supporters, the presence of his elegant and devoted wife Sarah, and the cooperation of certain Ottoman officials allowed Sabbatai to maintain something resembling royal splendor even while imprisoned at Abydos. Reports describing his life there soon spread widely among Jewish communities across Europe, Asia, and Africa, often in greatly exaggerated form. In some places in Europe, Jews even removed the roofs of their houses as if preparing for a new exodus. In nearly every synagogue his initials were displayed, and prayers were added asking for blessings upon our Lord and King, the holy and righteous Sabbatai Zevi, the Messiah of the God of Jacob. In Hamburg, the community council introduced a custom of praying for him not only on the Sabbath, but also on the second and fifth days of the week, and those who doubted his claims were required to remain in the synagogue and respond with a loud Amen. In many prayer books his image appeared alongside that of King David, together with various Kabbalistic formulas and acts of penance. These new practices created considerable unrest in several communities. In Moravia, the excitement became so intense that the government eventually intervened. In the Moroccan city of Sale, the local emir ordered persecution against the Jewish population. During this same period, Sabbatai announced that the traditional fasts of the 17th of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, which was also the day of his birth, would henceforth become festival days. He even considered turning Yom Kippur into a time of celebration. While Sabbatai was still confined in the prison at Abydos, an event occurred that ultimately led to his downfall. Jewish communities in Poland, having heard of his messianic claims, sent the Kabbalist Nehemiah HaKohen to speak with him. After a journey lasting about 3 months, Nehemiah reached Abydos at the beginning of September in the year 1666. Their meeting proved unsuccessful, as Nehemiah concluded that Sabbatai was an impostor. Some of Sabbatai's followers reportedly even considered killing Nehemiah as a rival. Nehemiah, however, managed to escape and went to Constantinople. There he pretended to adopt Islam in order to gain an audience with the Kaimakam, the acting governor, to whom he reported Sabbatai's ambitions. The Kaimakam then informed Sultan Mem IV. As a result, Sabbatai was taken from Abydos and brought to Adrianople. There the vizier presented him with 3 possible choices. He could submit to a test of his divine power by standing before a volley of arrows, with the expectation that if the archers failed to strike him his divinity would be proven. He could face execution by impalement, or he could convert to Islam. On the following day, the 16th day of September in the year 1666, Sabbatai appeared before the Sultan. He removed his Jewish garments, placed a turban upon his head, and converted to Islam. The Sultan, satisfied with this outcome, rewarded him by granting him the title of Effendi and appointing him as a doorkeeper with a generous salary. His wife Sarah and about 300 families among his followers also converted to Islam. These converts later became known as the Dönmeh. To further demonstrate the sincerity of his conversion, Sabbatai was instructed to take a second wife. A few days later he wrote to the Jewish community of Smyrna declaring that God had made him an Ishmaelite and that this transformation had occurred by divine command, describing it as the 9th day of his regeneration. Sabbatai's conversion shocked and deeply discouraged many of his followers, while Muslims often mocked them for their earlier devotion. Even so, a number of his adherents continued to believe in him. They argued that his conversion was part of a hidden messianic plan. Leaders such as Nathan of Gaza and Samuel Primo, who wished to preserve the movement, encouraged this interpretation. In many communities, the 17th of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av continued to be observed as festival days despite prohibitions and excommunications issued by rabbinic authorities. At times Sabbatai behaved as a devout Muslim and spoke harshly against Judaism, while at other moments he acted much like a Jew. In the month of March in the year 1668, He announced that during Passover he had been filled with the Holy Spirit and had received a new revelation. Either Sabbatai himself or one of his followers produced a mystical work asserting that he remained the true Messiah even after his conversion, claiming that his purpose was ultimately to bring thousands of Muslims to Judaism. Yet when speaking with the Sultan, he insisted that he was attempting to convert Jews to Islam, and on that basis he was allowed to meet with Jews and even address them in their synagogues. Over time, however, the Ottoman authorities grew weary of his behavior and eventually ended the salary attached to his position as doorkeeper. At the beginning of the year 1673, the Sultan ordered that Sabbatai be exiled to the coastal town of Ulsanj, known at the time as Dulcigno. There his wife died in the year 1674. Afterward he married Esther, the daughter of the Rabbi Joseph Philosoph of Thessaloniki. In the month of August in the year 1676, Sabbatai wrote to the Jewish community in Berat in Albania, asking them to send him religious books. Not long afterward, he died in relative isolation. Some accounts state that his death occurred on the 17th day of September in that same year, which coincided with the sacred day of Yom Kippur. After his death, his widow, his brother, and the children from his first marriage moved to Thessaloniki. For many years it was believed that his grave was located in Berat, within a Sufi lodge situated in the courtyard of the King Mosque, where a tomb remained until the later 20th century. Later research suggested that he had actually been buried in Dulcigno. His biographer Gershom Scholem recorded that pilgrims from the Dönmeh community of Salonika continued visiting his tomb until the early years of the 20th century. As Sabbatai Zevi was not a systematic thinker and communicated mostly through hints and metaphors, Nathan of Gaza must be seen as the principal architect of a complex system that combined a renewed version of Lurianic Kabbalah with original ideas regarding the Messiah's position within this new cosmic order. Nathan's teachings gained wide circulation, and their influence can be traced in many apparently orthodox Kabbalistic writings over the following 2 generations. Nathan accepted the Lurianic doctrine of Tzimtzum, but added a deeper layer to the understanding of the Godhead. As explained by Isaac Luria's doctrine, God began the process of creation by limiting the Ein Sof, infinite light, of the Godhead in order to allow for a conceptual space in which the 4 worlds, or finite realms, could exist. This primordial initial contraction, forming a vacant space into which new creative light could beam, is denoted by general reference to the Tzimtzum. In Kabbalistic interpretation, Tzimtzum gives rise to the paradox of simultaneous divine presence and absence within the vacuum and resultant creation. Various approaches exist as to how the paradox may be resolved, and as to the nature of Tzimtzum itself, and Nathan of Gaza explained it as follows. In Ein Sof there exist from the beginning 2 kinds of light, or aspects, which could even be likened to attributes in the sense used by Spinoza, the thoughtful light and the thoughtless light. The thoughtful light is entirely focused on the purpose of creation, while the thoughtless light consists of forces that have no creative aim, existing solely to remain as they are and resist any change. The act of Tzimtzum, undertaken to bring forth the cosmos, occurred solely within the thoughtful light, creating the possibility for it to project into the primordial void, known as the Tihiru, and erect the structures of creation. The thoughtless light, untouched by this act, remained in the Tihiru and by its very nature resisted creation, becoming ultimately a hostile and destructive force. The power of evil, or the Kalippa, is rooted in this non-creative light within God himself. Form and matter, therefore, are both grounded in Ein Sof. The thoughtless light is not intrinsically evil, but takes on that character by opposing all structures formed by the thoughtful light. The Tihiru, filled with thoughtless light mixed with residual traces of thoughtful light, is called Golem, the formless primordial matter. Creation proceeds through a dialectic between these 2 lights, a dialectic inherent in the very being of Ein Sof. After Tzimtzum, the thoughtful light streamed back along a straight line, the Kav Hayosha, into the Tihiru, initiating processes similar to those in Lurianic Kabbalah. It penetrated only the upper half of the primordial space, transforming and overpowering the thoughtless light there to construct the world of its intended thought. The lower half of the Tihiru, described as the deep of the great abyss, remained unreformed until the Messiah's advent, who alone could perfect it by allowing the thoughtful light to penetrate and transform it. Meanwhile, the thoughtless lights built their own structures, the demonic worlds of the Kelapot, whose sole purpose is to undo the work of the thoughtful light. These forces, called serpents dwelling in the great abyss, along with the satanic powers described in the Zohar as Sitra Ara, represent the other side of Ein Sof itself, resisting creation while simultaneously becoming entangled in it. Nathan also introduced a new theory concerning processes in the Tihiru prior to the entry of the straight line from Ein Sof, arising from the interaction between the residue of the thoughtful light and the golem forces. These interactions produced modes of being associated with the first configurations of the letters that would later form the Torah and cosmic script. Only when the straight line shone into the Tihiru were these initial structures, the work of primeval creation, Marasei Bereshit, transformed into more substantial forms, Marasei Merkava. All Lurianic processes, including the breaking of the vessels and the tikkun, were thus reinterpreted in light of the dialectic between the two lights. In this understanding of creation, the Messiah occupies a central position from the very beginning. Since Zimzum, the soul of the Messiah has been submerged in the lower half of the Tihiru. From the start of time, it has remained in the realm of the Kelapot, either as one of the sparks of the thoughtful light trapped in the Tihiru or as a soul captured by the Kelapot. Invaded by the thoughtless light and bound to its domination, this soul has struggled since creation amid indescribable suffering to free itself and undertake its great task, to open the lower Tihiru, or the primordial void, to the penetration of the thoughtful light and bring redemption and tikkun, meaning restoration, to the Kelapot. Their final transformation would produce a utopian unity and balance between the two aspects of Ein Sof. The straight line cannot penetrate the abyss until the Messiah has escaped the Kelapot's control. Unlike all other souls involved in tikkun, he has never been under the authority of the Torah, the mystical instrument of the thoughtful light. He represents a completely new authority, independent of the cosmic and historical laws of exile, operating according to his own law, which may become the utopian law of a redeemed world. Both his prehistory and his unique mission explain his actions after breaking free from the prison of the Kalippa. This doctrine allowed Nathan to justify every strange act of the Messiah, including his apostasy and antinomian behavior. He is the mystical counterpart of the red heifer, purifying the unclean while becoming impure himself. He is the holy serpent, subduing the serpents of the abyss, the Hebrew word for Messiah sharing the same numerical value as serpent. In each soul, the struggle between the thoughtful and thoughtless lights is constantly repeated. Ordinary holy souls are assisted by the Torah, but the Messiah is entirely on his own. Nathan developed these ideas in the new heretical Kabbalah with great detail and in various versions, demonstrating a remarkable capacity for framing paradoxical beliefs. They directly addressed the situation of those who accepted the mission of an apostate Messiah, and the dialectical rigor and mythological imagery of Nathan's writings made them deeply compelling for receptive minds. Outside the circles of the believers, Sabbatai Zevi's death passed almost unnoticed in the broader Jewish world. Among the adherents, it prompted deep soul-searching. Some followers appear to have abandoned the movement immediately afterward. Even his brother Elijah, who had joined him in Adrianople and converted to Islam, returned to Smyrna and to Judaism. The main activity of the Sabbatean groups was concentrated in three regions: Turkey, Italy, and Poland, particularly Lithuania, where active leaders, prophets, and claimants to Sabbatai Zevi's succession appeared. While believers were present in other parts of the diaspora, such as Kurdistan and Morocco, these three centers were the most significant. In Turkey, the largest groups were in Salonika, Smyrna, and Constantinople, although Sabbateanism survived in many Balkan communities, and at times members of the rabbinical courts were secret adherents. In Constantinople, their leader was Abraham Yakini, who died in 1682. A network of rabbis and Kabbalists guided less learned believers in Smyrna, even as the Orthodox gradually regained control there, as elsewhere. From 1674 to 1680, Cardozo emerged as the leading figure among the Sabbateans in Smyrna after leaving Tripoli around 1673, later extending his influence to Tunis and Leghorn. In Smyrna, he gained many followers, notably the young Rabbi Elijah B. Solomon Abraham Hakohen Itamari, who became a prolific writer and moral preacher and never abandoned his core convictions, and the cantor Daniel B. Israel Bonafu, who claimed mediumistic powers in later years. Between 1680 and 1697, Cardozo lived in Constantinople, Rodosto, and Adrianople, stirring controversy with his teachings and creating unrest through prophecies of imminent messianic fulfillment, particularly in 1682. He was eventually forced to leave these regions, spending his final years mainly in Candia, Crete, Chios, and, after an unsuccessful attempt to settle in Jerusalem, in Egypt. Though a staunch supporter of rabbinic tradition in practice as long as Sabbatai Zevi had not returned, he consistently opposed antinomian tendencies, meaning anti-law or tendencies to break the law, while anticipating a complete transformation of Torah practice in the time of redemption. Cardozo's influence ranked second only to Nathan's. His writings circulated widely, and he maintained close relations with Sabbatean leaders across the diaspora. Many of his polemics targeted Samuel Primo on one side and the radical Sabbateans of Salonika on the other. Primo, who later became chief rabbi of Adrianople and died in 1708, opposed any public Sabbatean activity, revealing his heretical ideas only within secretive conclaves. In Salonika, the situation was markedly different. The number of believers remained large, and the family of Sabbatai Zevi's last wife, led by her father Joseph Philosoph and her brother Jacob Quirito, openly displayed their convictions. Nathan retained important followers among the rabbis, including highly respected preachers and halakhic authorities. The continuing turbulence, particularly after Nathan's death, generated a renewed wave of excitement and new revelations. Visions of Sabbatai Zevi were widespread among believers, but in 1683 these visions prompted the mass apostasy of roughly 300 families who felt compelled to emulate the Messiah directly, contrasting with Sabbateans like Cardozo, who insisted that the Messiah's acts could not be imitated. Alongside earlier apostates, this group, led by Philosoph and Solomon Florentine, formed the sect of the Dönmeh, voluntary Marranos who practiced Islam publicly but adhered to a mixture of traditional and heretical Judaism in secret. Because of this history, the word Dönmeh itself still carries a tone of reproach or accusation. Members of the Dönmeh community were sometimes referred to as Salonikli, meaning a person from Thessalonica, or by the term of Deti, an Ottoman expression meaning religious convert. Within their own community they used different names for themselves. They called themselves the Believers, using the Hebrew term Homamanim. Other internal names included Abarim, meaning associates, and Baal Milm, meaning warriors. In the city of Adrianople, known today as Edirne, they were also called Sazanikos, a word from Judeo-Spanish meaning little carps. This nickname may have referred to the changing outward appearance of the fish, symbolizing the group's hidden identity, or it may have been connected to the prophecy that Sabbatai Zevi would deliver the Jewish people under the zodiacal sign associated with fish. Zevi's final wife, Ice, and her father, the respected Rabbi Joseph Philosoph, originally came from the city of Salonika. After Zevi's death, they returned there and helped establish the religious community that developed from his teachings. By the end of the 19th century, Thessaloniki contained a community of roughly 10,000 Judeo-Spanish-speaking Muslims connected to this tradition. A few thousand additional Sabbateans had already joined the movement earlier, shortly after the death of Nathan of Gaza in the late 17th century. Although they had publicly adopted Islam, many of these Sabbateans secretly remained devoted to their earlier beliefs and continued practicing a form of Judaism shaped by Kabbalistic ideas. They recognized Sabbatai Zevi as the true Jewish Messiah and continued to observe certain commandments that resembled those of rabbinic Judaism. Their religious life included prayers in Hebrew and Ladino, and they performed rituals commemorating important events in Zevi's life. His conversion to Islam was interpreted within their own understanding of Lurianic Kabbalah as part of a deeper mystical process rather than a rejection of faith. Over time, the Dönmeh community divided into several branches. The earliest group was known as the Izmirli, which formed in the city of Izmir, formerly called Smyrna, and represented the original sect. From this group, two additional branches later separated. The first division produced the Jacobite or Yacubi sect, founded by Jacob Quirito, the brother of Zevi's last wife. Quirito declared that he was the reincarnation of Zevi, and even proclaimed himself to be the Messiah in his own right. A second division occurred when Baruchia Russo claimed to be Zevi's rightful successor. His claims attracted considerable attention and led to the formation of another branch known as the Karakoshi, also called Conioso in Ladino. This group eventually became the most numerous and strict branch within the Dönmeh community. Throughout the 19th century, suspicions remained among many people that the Dönmeh of Thessaloniki was secretly Jewish. By the end of the 19th century, they played an active role in the expansion of Muslim education in Thessaloniki and contributed significantly to the commercial, administrative, and intellectual life of the city. Some became prosperous merchants and built European-style villas along the waterfront while participating in municipal politics. Others worked in skilled trades such as barbering, coppersmithing, and butchery. Their enthusiasm for European education and reformist ideas helped transform Thessaloniki into one of the most progressive and politically energetic cities of the Ottoman Empire. Certain commentators have even suggested that several prominent figures within the Young Turks, the anti-absolutist movement that forced the Ottoman Sultan to grant a constitution in the early 20th century, may have come from Dönmeh backgrounds. One individual connected with a later plot in Izmir to assassinate President Mustafa Kemal Ataturk after the establishment of the Turkish Republic was a Dönmeh named Mehmed Kaved. He had been a founding member of the Committee of Union and Progress and had served as the Ottoman Empire's Minister of Finance. After an official investigation, he was convicted and executed by hanging in the capital city of Ankara during the mid-1920s. Following the establishment of the Turkish Republic in the early 1920s, nationalist policies promoted by Ataturk, combined with anti-Semitic propaganda circulated by some nationalist publishers during the following decades, further complicated the position of minority groups. During the compulsory population exchange between Greece and Turkey in the early 1920s, the Dönmeh of Thessaloniki were officially classified as Muslims and were therefore relocated to Istanbul. In the Turkish capital, a smaller, but still influential community developed. Many members became successful businessmen, newspaper publishers, industrialists, and diplomats, continuing to occupy important positions within Turkish society. Reports from the early 1930s suggested that about 15,000 Dönmeh were living in Istanbul at that time. Publicly they lived as Muslims, yet privately they preserved their identity as Sabbatean Jews. As a result, they observed Muslim practices such as the fast of Ramadan while also maintaining Jewish customs, including the observance of Shabbat, the practice of Brit Milah, and the celebration of Jewish festivals. Much of their religious life combined elements drawn from Kabbalah, Sabbatean teaching, traditional Jewish law, and certain aspects of Sufi spirituality. Among their most important internal rules was the expectation that members should form relationships primarily within the sect rather than with outsiders, and that they should avoid marriage with both Jews and Muslims. Nevertheless, they maintained connections with rabbinic Jews who were secretly sympathetic to Sabbatean ideas but had not openly converted to Islam. They also consulted Jewish rabbis who quietly helped resolve questions involving Jewish law. Although the Dönmeh eventually divided into several different branches, they all shared the belief that Sabbatai Zevi was the true Jewish Messiah. They held that he had revealed a deeper spiritual Torah, which they believed stood above the ordinary, practical Torah observed in daily life. Their beliefs, influenced in part by Kabbalistic ideas about the nature of the divine, included the notion of a threefold relationship within the emanations of God. These teachings frequently brought them into conflict with both Muslim and Jewish communities. One of the most controversial accusations made against them concerned the reported custom of exchanging wives among members of the sect. The internal structure of the Dönmeh community reflected the different branches that had formed over time. At the top of this hierarchy stood the Izmirli branch, which largely consisted of merchants and members of the educated classes. Many artisans were associated with the Karakoshi branch, while people from poorer backgrounds were more commonly found among the Yacubi. Each of these branches maintained its own prayer community organized as a kohel, or congregation. Despite ideological differences between the groups, the Dönmeh created an extensive internal economic network that helped support members of lower social status within the community. After the establishment of the State of Israel in the year 1948, only a small number of Dönmeh families migrated from Muslim-majority countries to Israel. Several decades later, during the 1990s, an accountant named Ilgaz Zorlu publicly claimed that he was of Dönmeh descent through his mother. He began publishing articles in historical journals describing his identity and presenting information about the Dönmeh and their religious traditions. Because both the chief rabbinical authorities in Turkey and the official rabbinate in Israel did not recognize the Dönmeh as Jews without a formal and lengthy process of conversion, Zorlu turned to the legal system. In the summer of the year 2000, he applied to a court in Istanbul, asking that the religious designation on his Turkish identity card be changed from Islam to Jew, and he succeeded in winning the case. Soon afterward, a Turkish rabbinical court accepted him as Jewish. Despite this development, Dönmeh in general are not recognized as Jews under Israeli nationality law, and therefore are not eligible for immigration through the law of return. In some respects, the situation of the Dönmeh has been compared with that of the Falash Mura. They were frequently blamed either for secretly undermining the existing order through political upheaval or, conversely, for helping maintain the power of an oppressive system. In this context, the idea of the secret Jew took on a double meaning, both someone secretly belonging to the Jewish faith and someone imagined to be acting covertly in order to exercise influence. Some critics even argued that Dönmeh involvement lay behind major political changes such as the Young Turk Revolution, the overthrow of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, the dismantling of the Ottoman religious establishment, and the creation of a secular republic. Opponents of these developments, especially religious supporters of the Sultan, described them as part of a global Jewish and Freemasonic plot supposedly carried out by Turkey's Dönmeh. Certain Islamist writers also promoted conspiracy theories claiming that Ataturk himself was a Dönmeh, using such accusations in an effort to discredit his reforms and to produce further conspiratorial interpretations of modern Turkish history. Antinomian tendencies, meaning tendencies for breaking the law, were present among all the Sabbatean groups, but the subsect led by Baruchia Russo, also known as Osman Baba, placed them at the center of their practice. In the early years of the 18th century, Russo created another schism by teaching that the new spiritual or messianic Torah required a complete reversal of values, turning the 36 prohibitions of the Torah, known as karitot, into positive commandments, including forbidden sexual unions and incest. This subsect appears also to have developed the doctrine of Sabbatai Zevi's divinity, later attributed to Baruchia himself, who died in 1721. The doctrine of incarnation, as taught by Russo's group, became mistakenly generalized to all Sabbateans, causing considerable confusion. This wing became the most radical element of the Sabbatean underground, yet most believers did not follow the Dönmeh and remained within the Jewish fold, even in Salonika, where they persisted for some time. Many believers had anticipated 1706 as the year of Sabbatai Zevi's return, and the resulting disappointment weakened a movement that had already lost much of its active momentum. Sabbatean activity increasingly moved underground, a process accelerated by circulating reports of the extremist antinomian and nihilist teachings of Baruchia. Over time, Sabbateans were often incorrectly identified with this extreme wing, whose followers not only embraced mystical theory and visionary experience, but also acted on these ideas in their personal adherence to the law. Hayim Malak, one of the believers, traveled to Salonika and later spread the doctrine of secret antinomianism in Podolia, where it found particularly receptive audiences in smaller communities. Evidence from other parts of Europe is insufficient to clearly distinguish between the different underground factions. It is apparent, however, that the radical slogan asserting that the nullification of the Torah was its true fulfillment, and that, like grain buried in the earth, human deeds must in some sense decay in order to bring forth the fruit of redemption, had strong emotional appeal even to certain Talmudists and Kabbalists. Essentially, it represented an anti-rabbinic revolt within Judaism. The alarm this caused among rabbinic authorities, who considered the children of these sectarians illegitimate and therefore no longer admissible to the fold, was understandable. At the same time, a number of influential moral preachers and authors of ascetic literature were secret Sabbateans of the moderate or Hasidic wing. Jacob Frank was the founder of a Jewish sect that bore his name, representing the final stage in the development of the Sabbatean movement. He was born Jacob B. Judah Leib in Koroloka, a small town in Podolia, into a middle-class family. His father was a contractor and merchant, apparently well respected, and his grandfather had lived for a time in Kolish, while his mother came from Rosiso. Although Frank later claimed before the Inquisition that his father had served as a rabbi, this appears unfounded, though it is likely that he conducted services in Czernowitz, where he moved in the early 1730s. His father was scrupulously observant, and probably already had connections with the Sabbatean sect, which had gained influence in Podolia, Bukovina, and Wallachia. Frank received his education in Czernowitz and Snyeton, and spent several years in Bucharest. He attended Heder but gained no knowledge of Talmud, later boasting of this ignorance and of the qualities he possessed as a prostak, a simple man. His self-description as an ignoramus must be understood in the contemporary sense, a man who knew the Bible and Aggadah but was unskilled in Gemara. In his memoirs, he emphasized the pranks and bold adventures of his childhood and adolescence. In Bucharest he earned a living as a dealer in cloth, precious stones, and other commodities. Between 1745 and 1755, his trade took him across the Balkans and as far as Smyrna. Frank's earliest associations with Sabbateans are contradictory in his accounts, but they clearly extend back to his youth. His teacher in Czernowitz likely belonged to the sect and promised that Frank would be initiated into their faith after marriage, as was customary among Sabbateans. He began studying the Zohar and gained a reputation in Sabbatean circles as a man of special powers and inspiration. In 1752, he married Hannah, the daughter of a respected Ashkenazi merchant in Nikopol, Bulgaria. 2 Sabbatean emissaries from Podolia attended the wedding, and scholars of the sect accompanied him on his travels, initiating him into the mysteries of the faith. These men represented the extremist wing of Barakia Russo's disciples, leaders of the Dönmeh in Salonika. In 1753, Frank visited Salonika for the first time with these teachers and became involved with the Barakia group of the Dönmeh, though he followed the Polish practice and did not convert to Islam. After his marriage, trade became secondary to his role as a Sabbatean prophet. As part of his mission, he traveled to the grave of Nathan of Gaza, Adrianople, and Smyrna, spending considerable time again in Salonika in 1755. Through letters, his Sabbatean teachers and companions in Poland spread the news of his emergence as a new leader in Podolia, ultimately persuading him to return home. Frank was ambitious and domineering, with a low opinion of the Barakia sect in Salonika, which he called an empty house, while envisioning a great future for himself as the leader of the Sabbateans in Poland. Among close friends, he was given the Sephardi title Hokam Yaakov, and he was regarded as a new transmigration, a reincarnation of the divine soul that had previously resided in Sabbatai Zevi and Barakia, whom he referred to as the first and the second. By the end of the 18th century, the story persisted in Salonika's Dönmeh sects that Frank had gone to Poland on a mission from the Barakia sect. In his early activity, he faithfully followed the basic principles, teachings, and customs of this sect. On the 3rd of December, 1755, Jacob Frank, accompanied by Rabbi Mordecai and Rabbi Naaman, crossed the Dniester River and spent time with his relatives in Koroloka. He then traveled in solemn procession through the communities of Podolia, where Sabbatean cells existed. He was warmly received by the believers, while news spread through the general Jewish population of the arrival of a suspected Frank, the Yiddish term for a Sephardi. Frank, who had spent roughly 25 years in the Balkans and was thought to be a Turkish subject, behaved publicly like a Sephardi and spoke Ladino. He subsequently adopted Frank as his family name. At the end of January 1756, his appearance in Landscrown provoked a major scandal when he was discovered performing a Sabbatean ritual with his followers in a locked house. Opponents of the Sabbateans claimed they had caught the sectarians in the midst of a heretical religious orgy, similar to rites practiced by members of the Barakya sect, particularly in Podolia. Later, Frank asserted that he had deliberately opened the windows to compel the believers to act publicly rather than in secret as they had for decades. The believers, while outwardly observing Jewish law, in fact transgressed it, including sexual prohibitions, claiming to follow a higher form of Torah called Torah d'Azalut, or the spiritual Torah, as opposed to the Torah di-Beriah, the Torah of creation or halakhic Torah. The inquiry's results were presented at a rabbinical assembly in Brody in June 1756, and confirmed by the Council of the Four Lands in Constantinople in September. A herem, or excommunication, was proclaimed against the sect members, opening them to persecution and restricting study of Kabbalah and the Zohar for those under 40 years of age in the case of Isaac Luria's writings. The herem, when printed and distributed, triggered a wave of persecution against sect members, especially in Podolia. Polish rabbis consulted Jacob Emden, who advised them to seek help from Catholic authorities, arguing that the Sabbatean faith, being a mixture of other religions, constituted a new religion forbidden by canon law. Ironically, the result was the opposite of intended. Frank's followers, previously outwardly orthodox but secretly heretical, adopted a strategy of emphasizing, and even exaggerating, their common beliefs with Christianity to gain favor with the Catholic clergy, while their secret Sabbatean faith remained unchanged. Claiming to be contra-Talmudists, they sought church protection from persecutors, arguing that their alignment with certain Christian principles had provoked hostility. This strategy allowed them refuge under ecclesiastical authority, who saw them as potential converts. Meanwhile, members of the sect were compelled by their protectors to assist in anti-Jewish propaganda and draft declarations aimed at harming Polish Jewry, increasing mutual hostility and tensions. Throughout these events, Frank carefully avoided drawing attention to himself, appearing only as a spiritual guide showing his followers a path toward Christianity. The term Frankists was not used at this time and became common only in the 19th century. To the general Jewish public and rabbis, there was no distinction between the earlier Sabbateans and the new sect, which continued to be called the sect of Sabbatai Zevi. Even Frank's followers referred to themselves as Moramonim, or believers, in private conversation. In the events that followed, it is difficult to separate precisely the actions of Frank's followers from those imposed by the Church through ecclesiastical pressure, though it is clear that greater emphasis should be placed on the latter. Shortly after the herem at Brody, the Frankists petitioned Bishop Dembowski to hold a new inquiry into the Landskrown affair and requested a public disputation between themselves and the rabbis. On the 2nd of August, 1756, they presented 9 principles of their faith for debate. These were phrased ambiguously, but in brief they asserted: first, belief in the Torah of Moses; second, that the Torah and the prophets were obscure texts requiring interpretation by divine light rather than human reason; third, that the Talmud's interpretation of the Torah contained falsehoods and nonsense hostile to God's law; fourth, belief in one God who created all worlds; fifth, belief in a trinity of 3 equal faces within the one God, without division; sixth, that God manifested in human form without sin; seventh, that Jerusalem would not be rebuilt until the end of time; eighth, that Jews awaited the Messiah in vain; and ninth, that God himself would take human form to atone for the world's sins, bringing pardon and cleansing. These principles reflected the beliefs of the antinomian followers of Barakya, but they were deliberately framed to suggest reference to Jesus of Nazareth rather than to Sabbatai Zevi and Barakya, a clear attempt to mislead the Church, which did not understand and was uninterested in understanding their intention. The rabbis delayed nearly a year before accepting the disputation, which finally took place at Kamenik from the 20th to the 28th of June, 1757. On the 17th of October, 1757, Bishop Dembowski ruled in favor of the Frankists, imposing penalties on the rabbis, including condemnation of the Talmud as corrupt and ordering its public burning. Jewish homes were to be searched for copies. Contemporary accounts report that many cartloads of the Talmud were burned in Kamenik, Lvov, Brody, Zolkiw, and elsewhere. The burnings shocked the Jewish community, prompting rabbis to declare a fast. Influential Jews attempted to stop the destruction, which mainly occurred in November 1757. Fortune suddenly reversed for the Talmudists when Bishop Dembowski died on the 9th of November, at the height of the burnings. Jews saw divine intervention in his death, and persecution of the sect intensified, prompting many followers to flee across the Dniester to Turkey. There, several converted to Islam, and one group joined the Dönmeh in Salonika, known as the Poles. In December or early January 1759, Frank himself left Turkey and arrived in Iwani, where many of the believers from eastern Galicia were summoned. The Frankists only assumed a distinct identity as a separate sect during the months when the believers gathered in Iwani, an episode remembered by them as quasi-revelatory. It was there that Frank presented himself as the living embodiment of God's power, sent to complete the mission of Sabbatai Zevi and Barakyah, and as the true Jacob, likening himself to the patriarch Jacob who had completed the work of Abraham and Isaac. In Iwani, he conveyed his teachings through short statements and parables, organizing the ritual life of the sect. It was also there that he prepared the followers for the necessity of outwardly adopting Christianity, while secretly maintaining their true faith, mirroring the method of the Dönmeh with Islam. He taught that all religions were merely stages to be passed through, like changing garments, and then discarded as insignificant compared with the hidden true faith. Frank's originality lay in his bold rejection of the Sabbatean theology familiar to the believers from Nathan of Gaza and from the extreme Kabbalistic writings of Barakyah's followers. He urged them to forget these teachings, replacing them with a mythology stripped of Kabbalistic terminology, though it remained essentially a popularized, homiletical reinterpretation of Kabbalah. Instead of the Sabbatean trinity of the three knots of faith, Atika Kodesha, Malka Kodesha, and the Shekinah united in the divinity, Frank proclaimed that the true and good God was hidden, detached from creation and the mundane world. This God concealed himself behind the King of Kings, whom Frank also called the Great Brother, or He who stands before God, the God of true faith whom one must approach to overcome the authority of the three world rulers who dominate the earth through an improper legal system. The position of the Great Brother was linked in Frank's teaching to the Shekinah. Shekinah in Jewish theology means the divine presence of God, now called the Maiden or Virgin, a deliberate alignment with the Christian notion of the Virgin. Just as the extreme Sabbateans of Barakyah's sect saw Sabbatai Zevi and Barakyah as incarnations of Malka Kodesha, the God of Israel, Frank presented himself as the messenger of the Great Brother. In his view, all major religious figures, from the patriarchs to Sabbatai Zevi and Barakyah, had sought the way to God, yet none had succeeded. To bring about the revelation of God and the Virgin, it was necessary to embark on an entirely new path, unknown to Israel. This path Frank called the way to Esau. Here, Esau or Edom symbolized the unrestrained flow of life that liberates man, its power beyond any law. Though the patriarch Jacob promised to visit Esau in Seir, Scripture notes that he never completed the journey, the way being too difficult. In Frank's system, the time had come to take this path toward true life, a concept tied to freedom and licentiousness. This was a road to full religious anarchy. The place to which we are going is not subject to any law, because all that is on the side of death, but we are going to life. To reach this goal, the laws, teachings, and practices constraining life had to be abolished and destroyed, but secretly. Outwardly, the believers assumed the guise of Christianity, the corporeal Edom, completing their journey through Judaism and Islam. This Christian exterior was a cover for their true devotion to Frank as the Messiah and living God, with all expressions of Christian faith serving to conceal their actual belief. The motto Frank adopted in Iwani was Mosaduma, the burden of silence, taken from Isaiah and interpreted to mean that the hidden faith required bearing the heavy weight of the abolition of all law in complete secrecy, forbidding any disclosure to outsiders. Jesus of Nazareth was seen merely as a husk, a preliminary cover for the fruit that was Frank himself. While outward displays of Christian loyalty were necessary, Frank forbade mingling with Christians or intermarriage, for his ultimate vision remained a Jewish future, though expressed in a rebellious and revolutionary form, presented as a messianic ideal. Frank's concepts were popular and anecdotal, deliberately avoiding the complex symbolic terminology of traditional Kabbalah, which was inaccessible to ordinary followers, in order to engage the imagination. In irony, he prepared his adherents to accept baptism as the final step opening, in a tangible sense, the way to Esau, the realm of the Gentiles. In organizing the sect, Frank mirrored evangelical models, appointing 12 emissaries or apostles, his chief disciples, and simultaneously 12 sisters, whose main role was to serve as his concubines. Following the precedent of Baruch's sect, he instituted licentious sexual practices among his inner circle. Those accustomed to such behavior saw nothing objectionable, yet they resisted his insistence on destroying all Kabbalistic books, which he claimed had been superseded by his teaching. Many continued to draw on Sabbatean Kabbalah, blending its ideas with Frank's new symbols in their writings. The group remained in irony for several months until the spring of the year 1759. Frank established a common fund there, apparently modeled on the New Testament community of early Christians. In close proximity to him, his followers were overwhelmed by his magnetic personality, a combination of boundless ambition, cunning, eloquence, and imaginative capacity, tinged with poetic flair. Frank can be seen as a composite figure, despotic ruler, popular prophet, and shrewd impostor all in one. As events unfolded, two tendencies became evident. On one hand, Frank and his followers recognized that they could not remain suspended between Judaism and Christianity. To restore their position after the severe persecutions they had endured, baptism appeared to be the only viable option. They were willing to make a public demonstration of their conversion to Christianity, as the priests demanded for their protection. On the other hand, significant sections of the Church in Poland held different interests and never aligned themselves with the Frankist cause. At that time, several cases of the blood libel occurred in Poland, supported by influential bishops and leading clergy. Blood libel or ritual murder libel, also blood accusation, is an accusation against Jews of murdering Christians in order to use their blood in the performance of religious rituals. The Council of the Four Lands, the supreme authority of Polish Jewry, attempted to intervene indirectly through intermediaries with the ecclesiastical authorities in Rome, presenting grave accusations of deceit and insolence against those responsible for promoting the blood libel. Their concerns reached Rome, where some priests in the bishoprics of Kamenik and Lvov saw an opportunity to strengthen their position on the issue of the blood libel if a group of Jews could be found to publicly confirm the charge. At the end of February in the year 1759, when the Frankist position in irony was at its height, Frank's disciples petitioned Archbishop Lubicki in Lvov to admit them into the church, claiming to speak on behalf of the Jews of Poland, Hungary, Turkey, Moldavia, Italy, and elsewhere. They requested a second public disputation with the rabbinic Jews, defenders of the Talmud, promising to demonstrate the truth not only of Christian tenets but also of the blood libel. The text of this petition was almost certainly prepared in consultation with priestly circles and drafted by the Polish nobleman Maluda, who advised Frank on all negotiations leading up to the baptism. Archbishop Lubicki himself could not handle the matter, as he had been appointed Archbishop of Gniezno and Primate of the Polish Church. He delegated the case to his administrator in Lvov, Mikulski, a priest who became actively involved in organizing the major disputation, which was intended to culminate in mass baptism and confirmation of the blood libel. In the months that followed, the Frankists continued to send numerous petitions to the King of Poland and to ecclesiastical authorities to clarify their intentions and request specific privileges even after their conversion. They claimed that 5,000 adherents were ready to accept baptism, but simultaneously asked to be allowed to maintain a separate existence as Christians retaining their Jewish identity. They should not be required to shave their sideburns. They should be allowed to wear traditional Jewish clothing even after conversion, and to use their Jewish names alongside new Christian names. They should not be compelled to eat pork. They should be permitted to observe rest on both Saturday and Sunday. And they should be allowed to keep the Zohar and other Kabbalistic texts. Additionally, they requested that marriage be limited to members of their own group. In exchange for permission to constitute this quasi-Jewish unit, they expressed willingness to comply with other church demands. Some petitions added the request for a designated area of settlement in eastern Galicia, including the cities of Busk and Glignani, where most of the Jewish residents were members of the sect. In this territory, they promised to maintain their own community life and establish a productive structure distinct from that of the general Jewish population. The content of these requests demonstrates that Frank's followers had no intention of assimilating or mixing with other Christians, but aimed to secure a special recognized status, similar to the Dönmeh in Salonika, under both church and state protection. It is clear that they considered themselves a new type of Jew and did not intend to renounce their national identity. These petitions also indicate that Frank's more radical teachings had not fully taken hold among his followers, who were unwilling to follow him in every detail. The prohibition against intermarriage with Gentiles reiterated Frank's instructions in irony, yet on other matters there were disputes between Frank and his disciples. Nevertheless, these requests represented only a transitional stage in the struggle preceding the disputation in Lvov, and the sect's spokesman received a negative response. The Church required unconditional baptism, though at this point the priests believed the Frankists' intentions were sincere, ignoring warnings from Jewish representatives about the secret Sabbatean beliefs of those seeking baptism. The enormous publicity following the disputation at Kamenik stimulated missionary activity by some Protestant groups. Count Zinzendorf, head of the Fellowship of the Brethren in Germany, sent the convert David Kirchhoff in 1758 on a mission to the believers in Podolia to preach his version of pure Christianity. Among the wider Jewish population, rumors spread that Frank possessed great sorcerous and demonic powers, giving rise to numerous legends about his magical deeds and success. The Frankists attempted to postpone the Lvov disputation until January 1760, coinciding with gatherings of nobility and merchants for religious ceremonies and the Great Fair, apparently hoping for financial assistance to recover from losses caused by persecution. Authorities in Rome and Warsaw were not favorable to the proposed disputation and sided with the Jewish arguments against it, especially given the risk of disturbances and the contentious issue of the blood libel. The subject's potential to incite organized unrest among Polish Jews created additional anxiety. In this conflict between higher authorities favoring straightforward conversion and those interested in pursuing the blood libel, Mikulski acted according to his own judgment, supporting the latter group. He therefore set an early date for the disputation, the 16th of July, 1759, to be held in Lvov Cathedral, and required the rabbis of his diocese to attend. Frank himself attended only the final session, when the issue of the blood libel was debated. The Frankists presented their arguments in a form adapted as far as possible to Christian tenets, more so than in the earlier disputation, yet they avoided explicit mention of Jesus of Nazareth, intentionally harmonizing their secret faith in Frank as God and Messiah with their apparent support of Christianity. According to Frank, Christianity was merely a screen behind which lay the true faith, the sacred religion of Edom. 7 main propositions were debated. All biblical prophecies concerning the coming of the Messiah have already been fulfilled. The Messiah is the true God, incarnate in human form to suffer for redemption. Since the advent of the true Messiah, the sacrifices and ceremonial laws of the Torah have been abolished. Everyone must follow the religion and teachings of the Messiah for the salvation of the soul. The cross is the sign of the divine Trinity and the seal of the Messiah. Only through baptism can a man attain true faith in the Messiah. The Talmud teaches that Jews need Christian blood, and those who follow the Talmud are obliged to use it. The rabbis avoided replying to some propositions for fear of offending Christian authorities. The disputation began with a statement by the Frankists' protector, Miluda Kossadowski, and the rabbis addressed only the first 2 theological arguments. Attention quickly centered on the 7th proposition, whose implications were potentially dangerous for all Jewry. The Frankist defense of the blood libel drew on quotations from works by earlier Polish apostates, along with absurd arguments and nonsensical interpretations of rabbinic texts containing only minimal reference to blood or red. Ber Berkenthal noted that the rabbis used literary strategies to impress the Catholic priests and, during oral debates, rejected all Polish translations from Talmudic and rabbinic literature, provoking heated exchanges. Behind the scenes, the rabbis continued communication with Mikulski, who wavered under pressure from higher church authorities opposed to the blood libel and in response to arguments exposing Frankist duplicity. Debate on the blood libel continued during the final session on September 10th, when Rabbi Rappaport delivered a stringent attack. At the session's close, a Frankist told Rappaport, "You have declared our blood permitted. This is your blood for blood." The Frankists' convoluted reasoning failed to achieve the desired effect, and Mikulski ultimately requested a detailed written Polish reply from the rabbis. However, the deadline for their response was postponed until after the disputation's conclusion. Meanwhile, no concrete outcome emerged from the tumult surrounding the blood libel. The conversion of many Frankists did indeed take place. Frank himself was received with extraordinary honor in Lvov and sent his followers to the baptismal font. He was the first to be baptized on the 17th of September, 1759. Accounts differ regarding the total number of converts. In Lvov alone, more than 500 Frankists, including women and children, had been baptized by the end of 1760, most from Podolia, but some from Hungary and the European provinces of Turkey. Exact figures for other locations are unknown, though records indicate a significant number of baptisms in Warsaw, where Frank and his wife were baptized a second time in a royal ceremony under the patronage of the King of Poland on the 18th of November, 1759. From that point, he is referred to in documents as Joseph Frank. Oral tradition within Polish Frankist families claims that the number of converts was far greater, reaching several thousands. At the same time, most sectarians in Podolia and elsewhere did not follow Frank completely and remained within the Jewish fold, though they continued to acknowledge his leadership. In Bohemia, Moravia, and most of Hungary and Romania, the followers remained Jews, living a dual life, outwardly Jewish but secretly believers. Frank's journey to Warsaw in great pomp in October 1759 provoked a number of scandalous incidents, especially in Lublin. Even after their apostasy, his followers were constantly observed by priests who doubted the sincerity of their conversion. Reports of evidence given to ecclesiastical authorities regarding their real faith vary, likely originating from different sources. In particular, G. Pikulski, in December 1759, obtained separate confessions from 6 of the Brethren who had remained in Lvov, revealing that their true devotion was to Frank as the living incarnation of God. When this information reached Warsaw, Frank was arrested on the 6th of February, 1760, and subjected for 3 weeks to a detailed investigation by the ecclesiastical court, which also questioned many of the believers who had accompanied him. His testimony was a mixture of lies and half-truths. The court decided to exile him for an indefinite period to the fortress of Czestochowa, under the highest ecclesiastical jurisdiction, to prevent him from influencing his followers. His disciples were released and ordered to practice Christianity faithfully and forsake their leader, a result that was not achieved. Nevertheless, the perceived treachery of his followers in revealing their beliefs continued to anger Frank until the end of his days. The court also issued a printed proclamation of the inquiry's findings. At the end of February, Frank was exiled and remained in honorable captivity for 13 years. Initially abandoned, he quickly re-established contact with his followers, who were scattered in small towns and estates owned by the nobility. The apostates suffered greatly before finally settling mainly in Warsaw, with others in towns such as Krakow and Krasnystor. They organized themselves into a secret sectarian society, outwardly observing all Catholic rites. They exploited Poland's unstable political situation near the end of its independence, with some prominent families successfully claiming noble status for Jewish converts under old statutes. From the end of 1760, emissaries from the Believers began visiting Frank to receive instructions. Following these contacts, they became involved in a blood libel case in Wojciech in 1761, resulting in the killing of many Jews. This re-emergence of Frankists as accusers provoked deep resentment among Polish Jews, who saw it as a new act of vengeance. Conditions of Frank's imprisonment gradually eased. By 1762, his wife was allowed to join him, and a group of chief followers settled near the fortress, practicing secret rites of a sexual and orgiastic nature within it. In discussions with this inner circle, Frank added a specifically Christian interpretation to his conception of the Virgin as the Shekinah, influenced by the Polish cult of the Virgin at Częstochowa. In 1765, as the country neared dissolution, Frank sought to establish ties with the Russian Orthodox Church and government through Prince Repnin, a Russian ambassador in Poland. A Frankist delegation traveled to Smolensk and Moscow at year's end, promising to promote pro-Russian activity among Jews, though details are unclear. These contacts may mark the beginning of secret Frankist links with Russian authorities. Polish Jews became aware of these plans, and in 1767 a counter-delegation went to St. Petersburg to inform the Russians of the Frankists' true nature. Thereafter, Frankist propaganda spread anew through Galicia, Hungary, Moravia, and Bohemia via letters and emissaries among the sect's educated members. Connections were also formed with secret Sabbateans in Germany. In 1768 and 69, two Frankist agents operated in Prague and Posnitz, a Sabbatean center in Moravia, even preaching in synagogues. At the beginning of 1770, Frank's wife died, and the veneration previously given to her transferred to his daughter Eva, formerly Rachel, who remained with him even after most followers had left the fortress for Warsaw. When Częstochowa fell to Russian forces in August 1772, following the first partition of Poland, Frank was freed by the commanding officer and left the town early in 1773, traveling with his daughter to Warsaw. In March 1773, he journeyed with 18 associates, disguised as servants of a wealthy merchant, to Brünn in Moravia, to the home of his cousin Schondel Dobruschka, the wife of a rich and influential Jew. Frank remained in Brünn until 1786, securing the protection of the authorities both as a wealthy and well-connected man and as one pledged to promote Christianity among his followers in Moravian communities. He established a semi-military structure among his retinue, with men wearing uniforms and undergoing formal training. His court attracted many Sabbateans in Moravia, whose families preserved the swords worn during their service for generations. In March 1775, Frank traveled with his daughter to Vienna, where they were received by the Empress and her son, later Joseph II. Some accounts suggest that Frank promised the Empress the support of his followers in a campaign against parts of Turkey, and indeed over time several Frankist emissaries were sent to Turkey, cooperating with the Dönmeh and possibly serving as political agents or spies for the Austrian government. During this period, Frank frequently spoke of a general revolution that would overturn kingdoms, particularly the Catholic Church, and he envisioned the conquest of territory in the wars at the end of time that would become Frankist dominion. Military training for his followers was part of this preparation. The source of funds for maintaining his court remained a matter of speculation, likely involving some system of taxation among sect members. Rumors circulated about barrels of gold arriving, allegedly from his followers or, according to others, from foreign political patrons. At one point, Brünn housed several hundred sectarians who followed no trade and were entirely subject to Frank, who ruled with absolute authority. In 1784, his financial resources temporarily failed, but his situation later improved. During his stay, much of his teaching, recollections, and tales were recorded by his chief associates. In 1786 or 87, Frank left Brünn and, after negotiations with the Prince of Isenburg, settled in Offenbach near Frankfurt. In both Brünn and Offenbach, Frank and his 3 children maintained a carefully constructed public persona for many years, presenting themselves as outwardly Catholic while staging exotic Eastern practices to reinforce an aura of mystery. In his later years, Frank propagated among his closest followers the claim that his daughter Eva was the illegitimate child of Empress Catherine of the Romanov line, and that he was her guardian. Outwardly, the Frankists avoided social contact with Jews, so that many who had dealings with them dismissed any Jewish claims that the sect was secretly Jewish. Even printed proclamations in Offenbach emphasized the children's supposed ties to the Russian royal house, and some officials in the Prince of Isenburg's administration reportedly recognized Eva as a Romanov princess. The final center of the sect was established in Offenbach, where members sent their children to serve at the court, following the model set in Brünn. Frank suffered several apoplectic fits and died on the 10th of December, 1791. His funeral was organized as a grand demonstration by hundreds of his followers. Until the end, Frank maintained his double life, preserving the legendary Oriental atmosphere of his court in the eyes of both Jews and Christians. In the period following Frank's apostasy and until his death, the converts strengthened their economic standing, especially in Warsaw, where many established factories and participated actively in Masonic organizations. About 50 Frankist families, led by Anton Czerniawski, one of Frank's principal disciples, settled in Bukowina after his death and became known there as the sect of Abrahamites. Their descendants continued to live separately for over a century. Several families in Moravia and Bohemia, who had remained within the Jewish fold, also improved their social position, maintained close ties with the Haskalah movement, and began blending mystical Kabbalistic ideas with the rationalist perspectives of the Enlightenment. Some of those who had converted under Frank's influence were integrated into the Austrian aristocracy and higher administration, yet retained certain Frankist traditions and customs, creating a stratum in which the boundaries between Judaism and Christianity were often blurred, regardless of whether members had converted or remained Jewish. Moses, the son of Shondel de Bruschka, Frank's cousin and widely recognized as his nephew, became a prominent figure in the final generation of Frankists. Known successively as Franz Thomas von Schoenfeld, a German writer and organizer of a mystical Jewish-Christian Kabbalistic order, and later as Junius Frey, a Jacobin revolutionary in France, he was apparently offered the leadership of the sect after Frank's death but declined. Leadership then passed to Eva, Frank's daughter, and her younger brothers Joseph and Rochus. Although followers continued to visit Offenbach, called Gott's house by the believers, Eva and her brothers lacked the authority and strength of character required, and the sect's fortunes quickly waned. The only independent activity that persisted from Offenbach was the sending of the Red Letters in 1799 to hundreds of Jewish communities across Europe, urging Jews to enter the holy religion of Edom. By 1803, Offenbach was nearly deserted, with most of the believers returning to Poland, and Frank's children reduced to poverty. Joseph and Rochus died in 1807 and 1813 respectively, without heirs, while Eva Frank died in 1816, leaving substantial debts. In her later years, a few members of respected Frankist families, supported from Warsaw, remained with her. During the last 15 years of her life, she cultivated the persona of a Romanov princess, and several circles believed the stories circulating in support of this claim. During this period, the sect maintained its exclusive organization through traveling agents, secret gatherings, private religious rites, and dissemination of Frankist literature. The believers continued to marry only within the sect, creating a wide network of inter-family connections, even among those who had remained within Judaism. The followers were captivated by Frank's words and his vision of a unique fusion of Judaism and Christianity, while also maintaining modest aspirations that aligned with liberal bourgeois ideals. Their nihilist Sabbatean faith acted as a bridge to life beyond the ghetto. Over time, they abandoned licentious practices and acquired reputations for high moral conduct. Many Frankist families preserved miniatures of Eva Frank, sent to prominent households, and to this day some honor her as a saintly woman who had been unjustly reviled. Attention must now turn to the inner substance of the spiritual outlook held by these Sabbatean groups. Although the detailed structure of their mystical doctrines requires familiarity with the complexities of Kabbalistic thought, especially as developed in earlier traditions, certain central ideas concerning their understanding of the divine and their broader concerns can be presented in a more accessible form. The central question that confronted the believers after the apostasy of Sabbatai Zevi, and to which they continually returned, was this: if all outward signs had indicated that redemption was already unfolding, and if the Messiah, whose mission they did not doubt, had revealed himself, why had he abandoned both his people and his faith? Why had the expected historical and political liberation, which was thought to accompany the cosmic process of restoration, failed to materialize? The answer that emerged was strikingly paradoxical. The apostasy of the Messiah itself was to be understood as a profound religious mystery. It was argued that even authoritative tradition had taught that the details of redemption could not be known in advance. what had taken place, it was claimed, had in fact been foreshadowed in sacred texts, though such hints could only be properly understood after the events themselves had occurred. Thinkers such as Nathan of Gaza and Abraham Cardozo developed these ideas further, presenting them as part of a new theological interpretation that Sabbatai Zevi himself was believed to endorse. According to this explanation, the process of redemption could not be completed as long as the last sparks of holiness, scattered at the time of humanity's primordial fall, remained trapped within the realm of impurity. These sparks, embedded within the forces of evil, sustained the existence of that realm. The task of the Redeemer, therefore, was to accomplish what no righteous figure before him had achieved, to descend into the depths of impurity and recover those remaining sparks. Once this mission was fulfilled, the domain of evil would collapse, deprived of the very elements that sustained it. In order to carry out this task, the Messiah was required to perform strange acts, actions that outwardly appeared shocking or contradictory, of which his apostasy was the most dramatic example. Yet these acts were interpreted as necessary steps in the fulfillment of his mission. In this light, it was even suggested that the Messiah must assume a concealed identity, adopting forms that would render him unrecognizable, so that his redemptive work could proceed within the hidden realms where it was most needed. Before examining this bold and heretical doctrine more closely, it is worth pausing over the words of Cardozo himself, for they offer a key insight into its underlying motivation, as well as into many other aspects of the Sabbatean movement. At the heart of the originality of Sabbatean thought lay the profoundly paradoxical religious sensibility of the Marranos and their descendants, who formed a significant part of Sephardic Jewry. Marranos were Spanish and Portuguese Jews, as well as Navarrese Jews, who converted to Christianity, either voluntarily or by Spanish or Portuguese royal coercion, during the 15th and 16th centuries, but who continued to practice Judaism in secret or were suspected of it. Therefore the term Marrano or Marranism is practically synonymous with convert or conversion. Without the distinctive psychological experience of these returnees to Judaism, the new theology would not have found such fertile ground in which to develop. Whatever the precise origins of its earliest advocates, the Sabbatean conception of the Messiah corresponded remarkably well to the inner needs of the Marranic mindset. It is known, moreover, that Abraham Cardozo himself, one of the most active proponents of the movement, came from a Marrano background, having been born in Spain in the early 17th century, a fact that helps to explain both his fervor and his deep personal commitment to the doctrine. The religious consciousness of the Marranos was marked by tension, duality, and contradiction. For those who had lived outwardly as adherents of another faith while inwardly maintaining their Jewish identity, the act of assuming a concealed or divided religious existence was neither unfamiliar nor inherently troubling. They often justified such behavior by appealing to biblical precedents, seeing in them a validation of their own condition. Formal apostasy, in their experience, did not necessarily signify a definitive rupture with their original faith. Now, however, a theological system emerged that elevated precisely this kind of existence to the highest religious level by attributing it to the Messiah himself. This idea carried far-reaching implications, which would unfold over time, but its core meaning demands closer attention. At the outset, this new doctrine could not easily be reconciled with the traditional popular image of the Messiah unless a place could somehow be found within it for the apparent contradiction of a Redeemer who abandons his faith. Initially, it may have been assumed that the Messiah's descent into the realm of impurity was only a secondary or incidental feature of his mission. Yet it soon became clear that such an event was too central to be treated as merely accidental. If necessary, the entire structure of messianic belief would have to be reorganized around it. If the Messiah's mission contained a tragic dimension, then this too would need to be grounded in the sources and attitudes of Jewish tradition. In this respect, developments within Sabbateanism bear comparison to earlier transformations in Christianity, though here the decisive moment of tragedy was shifted from a physical death to the act of apostasy itself, intensifying the paradox even further. Closely connected with this was another idea, one that had precedence in earlier interpretive traditions, but whose deeper implications had long remained dormant. This was the notion that in the age of redemption a new Torah would be revealed, and that the commandments as previously understood might lose their binding force. While such speculations had appeared in earlier teachings, they had never carried decisive authority and were often balanced by opposing views, leaving the matter unresolved within the tradition. Even those who imagined a renewed divine word in a redeemed world did not generally associate it directly with the activity of the Messiah. It was only within the framework of this new doctrine, shaped by the Moranic experience, that the latent force of such ideas was fully realized. The teaching concerning the necessary apostasy of the Messiah did not arise first as a theoretical construction, but from powerful new religious experiences. Only afterward did the effort begin to justify these experiences by drawing upon authoritative texts, and this effort proved extraordinarily creative. From scattered scriptural passages, paradoxical statements, and fragments drawn from mystical writings, a new theological language was rapidly formed. What emerged was a distinctive religious vocabulary, separate from that of other traditions, yet equally intent on expressing the contradictions inherent in the idea of redemption and in the figure of the Redeemer. This new language drew its strength from deep emotional sources, and its appeal lay in its ability to infuse familiar expressions with new and striking meanings. The sudden emergence of such a dynamic reinterpretation of inherited concepts is a rare occurrence. Some observers dismissed these developments as mere distortions or as a pretext for moral decline, but such judgments fail to grasp their deeper significance. Although the doctrine of an apostate Messiah could indeed be misused in various ways, it would never have gained widespread acceptance had it not resonated with fundamental elements in the religious consciousness of its adherents. Above all, it spoke to a powerful sense of spiritual mission, an idea already emphasized in earlier mystical teachings, which assigned to every individual a role in the process of restoring the divine order by raising and redeeming the scattered sparks within creation. At this stage, a central role was assigned to the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. In its new interpretation, the verse, "He was wounded because of our transgressions," was understood as referring not only to the Messiah ben Joseph. In Jewish tradition, the term ben stands for the son of, so in this case the son of Joseph, the traditional forerunner destined to suffer and die, but also to the Messiah ben David himself, who would be prevented from observing the Torah. Through a deliberate reinterpretation of language, the phrase describing the Messiah as wounded was taken to imply a transformation from sacred to profane. Since the nations outside Israel were regarded as belonging to the realm of impurity, while Israel alone was considered holy, it followed that even a transgressing Jew remained within the sphere of holiness so long as he remained among his people. Therefore, the only way for the Messiah to become profane was by leaving the community of Israel and entering another domain. Similar interpretations were developed for other passages of the same chapter, particularly those describing the suffering and humiliation of the figure in question. Another frequently cited verse spoke of a leader being separated from his people and later restored, which was taken as a direct reference to the destiny of the Messiah. Numerous biblical texts were thus gathered to support the idea that the Messiah would be rejected, condemned, and cast out by his own people. In this framework, arguments once used by the Marranos to justify their own condition were now applied to Sabbatai Zevi. The example of Esther was invoked as a parallel. Although she appeared to violate the law by joining herself to a foreign ruler, her actions were understood by the wise as part of a hidden plan leading to redemption. What seemed like transgression on the surface concealed a deeper purpose. In a similar manner, the traditional saying that the final Redeemer would resemble the first was interpreted to mean that just as Moses had lived for a time in a foreign court, so too the Messiah must dwell among foreign powers. As the end of exile approached, it was believed that the Messiah himself must undergo exile as an act of atonement on behalf of Israel. The same method of reinterpretation was then applied to mystical writings. Passages were drawn from earlier sources and reshaped to yield new symbolic meanings, including the image of a ruler who is inwardly good but outwardly clothed in evil. Even when objections were raised that such texts did not originally refer to the Messiah, their suggestive power proved difficult to resist, and they became firmly embedded in Sabbatean thought. Other earlier authorities were also reinterpreted, their writings mined for hints that could be read as anticipating the Messiah's association with foreign realms or conditions of concealment. In this way, The belief that the Messiah's fall and apostasy were necessary elements of redemption was systematically supported. Numerous sermons, treatises, and writings were produced to defend and elaborate this doctrine, drawing from many different parts of Jewish literature. At first, it was often argued that the Messiah's conversion had been forced upon him, though still possessing a deeper intentional meaning. Over time, however, this explanation gave way to a more radical view. The Messiah's descent into impurity was understood as a deliberate and voluntary act, essential to the fulfillment of his mission. At this point, an older rabbinic concept, that a commandment might be fulfilled through what appears to be a transgression, acquired a new and far-reaching significance. Once it was asserted that the Messiah's actions were not violations at all, but rather expressions of divine will, the question of the continued authority of the law became increasingly pressing. Even before his apostasy, Sabbatai Zevi had already engaged in actions that seemed to contravene established commandments, such as altering ritual practices and disregarding certain prohibitions. His followers sought to interpret these acts in light of the new theology, and in doing so began to diverge in their conclusions. From these differing interpretations, a division gradually emerged that would eventually lead to a clear split within the movement itself. The apostasy of the Messiah was accepted by all the believers and came to be seen as far more symbolically meaningful than had first been assumed. It gave expression, with striking clarity, to the contradiction between the outward course of history and the inward reality experienced by the believers themselves. The delay of visible redemption no longer appeared puzzling, since it could now be explained through the idea of goodness concealed beneath an outward form of evil. Yet this interpretation gave rise to further questions that could not easily be resolved by the doctrine alone. One question concerned the nature of the Messiah's act. Was it meant to serve as an example for others to follow, or was it unique and inimitable? Another issue involved the character of the transitional period during which the Messiah was understood to be within the realm of impurity. Could this period itself be called redemption, or was it only a stage leading toward it? Since it was widely believed that the divine presence had already been restored, it became necessary to ask where that presence now resided, and whether it was still meaningful to speak of exile. Closely related to this was the problem of how inner transformation related to the unchanged outward world. A further and especially pressing question concerned the status of the Torah during this period. Had a new dimension of it been revealed? How was one to understand the principle that a commandment might be fulfilled through an apparent transgression? If the structure of the divine order had undergone a fundamental change, did this not require a corresponding change in the observance of the commandments, which had originally been intended to repair a broken cosmos? In this light, it was even asked whether earlier mystical teachings retained their relevance. The issues themselves were closely interconnected, and the conclusions drawn from them formed a coherent, if controversial, system. Out of these debates emerged two main tendencies within Sabbateanism. On the one hand stood a more moderate and traditionally inclined group. On the other, a radical current characterized by antinomian and increasingly extreme interpretations. Each of these tendencies contained further internal divisions, but their general orientations can be distinguished. It is not always possible to determine the precise position of every adherent, since many concealed their views, especially under conditions of persecution, and were reluctant to express them openly or commit them to writing. This was particularly true of the more radical groups, whose doctrines required careful concealment. The moderate current, represented by figures such as Nathan of Gaza, Abraham Cardozo, and Abraham Rovigo, held that the Messiah's apostasy was not intended as a model for imitation. Although Sabbatai Zevi had performed what was necessary, his act was unique and carried out on behalf of all. To imitate it would be to misunderstand its purpose. The individual believer, therefore, remained bound to the identity and obligations of a Jew. While a new era had indeed begun and the spiritual realms had undergone transformation, this change had not yet manifested itself in the external world. As long as the visible conditions of exile persisted, the commandments of the Torah were to remain in force, with only a few symbolic modifications introduced by the Messiah and his followers. Even these limited changes were subject to debate. Certain practices that had been altered or suspended were later restored by some adherents, not as a rejection of belief, but out of uncertainty regarding their legitimacy. On the whole, the moderates maintained that during this transitional phase the forces of impurity still retained influence, and that the continued observance of the commandments was necessary to counteract them. The outward structure of traditional religious life was therefore to be preserved, even though profound changes were believed to have taken place within it. One indication of this inner transformation was the gradual abandonment by many of earlier forms of mystical practice, which were seen as no longer fully suited to the new spiritual condition. The first to abandon the use of the traditional mystical meditations was Nathan of Gaza, who explained his decision in terms of the profound transformation that had, in his view, already taken place within the divine order. These meditations had originally been understood as inward acts of thought, intended to connect the performance of commandments and prayers with specific stages in the unfolding of the divine worlds. Through them, the practitioner sought to restore harmony to a cosmos that had been disrupted, reintegrating its scattered elements and returning them to their proper place. Each such act expressed the belief that outward religious observance was invisibly aligned with a deeper structure of reality. With the coming of the Messiah, however, it was believed that this structure itself had been altered. The inner sense of freedom experienced by the believers was not regarded as a mere subjective feeling, but as the result of an actual reordering of the divine worlds. In this new situation, the earlier forms of meditation were no longer appropriate. This led to a reassessment of the entire earlier mystical system, and at times even to indirect criticism of its founder. It was argued that those practices had belonged to a previous age and were no longer suited to the present condition, which was now likened to a sacred time that demanded a different mode of spiritual engagement. What had once been fitting was now seen as out of place, and adherence to it was discouraged. Similarly, practices associated with mourning for the exile of the divine presence were reconsidered. Since it was believed that this exile had already begun to come to an end, such expressions of lament were viewed as misguided. To continue them was thought to misunderstand the new reality, in which a process of restoration was already underway. Although some attempted to introduce revised forms of meditation adapted to the new circumstances, these innovations did not gain wide acceptance. Many adherents either abandoned such practices altogether or adopted more personal and individualized forms of spiritual reflection. At the same time, it was widely believed among Sabbateans that the present moment marked the threshold of a new revelation. The hidden nature of the divine, which had remained only partially disclosed throughout earlier generations, was now expected to become clearer. While earlier traditions were thought to contain hints of this deeper truth, their full meaning had not been grasped. Only now, in the unfolding of redemption, could these concealed insights begin to emerge into clarity. Even so, it was understood that this revelation was still incomplete, and that only part of the mystery had thus far been disclosed. This belief led to the development of new speculative teachings concerning the nature of the divine. A foundational text of this emerging system was attributed to Sabbatai Zevi himself, who was said to have communicated it to a disciple after his apostasy. In this work, a new stage was introduced into the account of the divine process, extending speculation beyond what earlier systems had attempted to describe. Instead of focusing solely on the unfolding of creation after its initial contraction, attention was directed to a more hidden and primordial aspect of divine existence, thereby expanding the scope of mystical reflection. Throughout these developments, a willingness to embrace paradox remained a defining feature of Sabbatean thought. This was evident not only in their interpretation of the Messiah's role, but also in their reflections on the nature of faith and its history within Israel. Their ideas displayed a bold and dialectical character, seeking to reconcile seemingly incompatible elements within a single framework. In doing so, they revealed a complex inner world shaped by both continuity and rupture. Those who adhered to these views often regarded themselves as faithful to the deeper essence of Judaism, even while departing from its established forms. The authority of rabbinic tradition, associated with the conditions of exile, was increasingly called into question. Although many continued to live within its outward structure, this was not necessarily accompanied by a sense of commitment to its validity. Rather, it was seen as belonging to an earlier stage that had now been surpassed by the reality of redemption. What is particularly striking is the nature of the spiritual landscape that emerged from this search for hidden truth. In their reinterpretation of sacred texts, these thinkers arrived at ideas that bore a surprising resemblance to much older currents of religious thought, specifically Gnosticism, reappearing in a transformed and revalued manner. This unexpected convergence reveals the depth and originality of the movement's attempt to grapple with the mystery of the divine in a time of profound upheaval. Certain thinkers in late antiquity had already developed the idea that a distinction must be made between a hidden and wholly good God, worthy of devotion, and a creator of the material world, identified with the just but inferior deity described in Scripture. These figures did not entirely reject the biblical narrative, but they denied the supremacy of the God portrayed in it, assigning him instead a lower status. According to this view, salvation came through emissaries of the hidden God, who sought to liberate the soul from the rigid dominion of the Creator, whose rule over the material world was seen as a sign of limitation. The hidden God remained unknown, yet entrusted chosen messengers with the task of revealing a higher truth. The belief that the God of creation and the transcendent source of goodness were identical was regarded as a profound error. Such ideas did not disappear with their original proponents, but continued to resurface in various forms over time. Within Sabbatean thought, a new formulation of this ancient paradox emerged, presented as the rediscovery of the true mystery of the Godhead, and identified with the authentic faith of Israel. In this interpretation, it was argued that reason alone could establish the existence of a first cause responsible for all motion and existence. Since this principle could be grasped through intellectual reflection, it was considered unnecessary for religion to reveal it. A revelation, by contrast, must convey something beyond the reach of reason, something possessing genuine religious significance. Accordingly, the first cause was not seen as the proper object of religious life, since it neither governed the world in a direct sense nor engaged in its unfolding. Instead, religious attention was directed toward the God revealed in the Torah, the God of Israel, who was understood as the active creator and as the first emanation from the ultimate source. This God, in turn, was described as possessing distinct aspects, including a dimension associated with the divine presence in the world. It was this God who created, revealed, and redeemed, and to whom prayer and devotion were properly addressed. The essential paradox, therefore, lay in the distinction between the abstract first cause and the living God of religion. This distinction was regarded as the hidden core of the ancient faith, preserved in sacred texts and interpretive traditions but obscured over time. According to this view, the long period of exile had led to a confusion between these two levels, causing the people to identify the impersonal principle of existence with the personal God of revelation. This misunderstanding was seen as a profound spiritual error, reinforced by philosophical interpretations that blurred the distinction. Only with the end of exile would the true nature of the divine once again be revealed, restoring clarity to what had been concealed. This conception retained the structure of earlier dualistic thought, but transformed it in a distinctive way. The higher, hidden principle was no longer the focus of religious devotion, while the God of Israel assumed the central role as the object of faith and worship. Such a reinterpretation reflected a bold and complex effort to renew religious understanding, combining a longing for spiritual regeneration with a rejection of established forms associated with exile. Those who embraced these ideas often expressed a sharp critique of the inherited religious order, viewing it as inadequate to the new reality they believed had emerged. They saw themselves as participating in a process of renewal that required a return to foundational sources and a re-examination of tradition. This attitude provoked strong opposition from defenders of established authority, who regarded it as a dangerous departure from accepted belief and practice. Yet despite this conflict, the movement's ideas retained a connection to deeply rooted elements within the tradition. Their emphasis on returning to primary texts and uncovering hidden meanings reflected a desire to recover an original and authentic faith. Among more radical adherents, this tendency became especially pronounced, accompanied by a readiness to embrace paradox and to draw upon the most unusual and challenging interpretations as expressions of a deeper truth. In this way, what appeared strange or even offensive to conventional understanding could be taken as a sign of the concealed mystery at the heart of belief. Disputes over how to understand the mystery of the Godhead gave rise to intense debate among the Sabbateans, and the interpretations that emerged often diverged sharply from that of Cardozo, who devoted his greatest speculative effort to the issue. Although these writings made use of the language of the Zohar and the Lurianic Kabbalah, they infused it with entirely new meanings. Among those whose views have survived in detail are Nehemiah Hayon, Samuel Primo, and Jonathan Iberskites. Even while they spoke of three aspects within the divine, the first cause, the God of Israel, and the Shekinah, they nevertheless insisted on preserving the essential unity and dynamic cohesion of the Godhead. Their central concern was to clarify the relationship between these three elements, described as the knots of faith, and to define the precise nature of the new revelation concerning the God of Israel. At the same time, these more moderate thinkers firmly rejected any notion resembling divine incarnation, and their writings frequently contained sharp polemics against Christianity and its doctrine of the Trinity. Some among the moderates held that the full meaning of this divine mystery had not yet been disclosed. During the early period of Messianic awakening, an initial revelation had been permitted, but in the subsequent era of uncertainty and concealment, such openness was no longer possible. It was believed that the Shekinah had indeed begun to rise, yet had not fully returned to her place. Had that process been complete, exile itself would have ended. Even decades after the apostasy of Sabbatai Zevi, certain adherents remained convinced of its profound significance, while maintaining that redemption unfolded gradually, step by step, and had not yet reached its outward fulfillment. This perspective allowed many who were inwardly committed believers to continue functioning within traditional religious roles. Since redemption was incomplete, the practices of historical Judaism were still to be observed, including rituals that had briefly been set aside. Thus, moderate Sabbateanism combined a deep internal transformation with outward fidelity to established religious life. This adherence was not merely a disguise, but a principled stance. The inner upheaval experienced by the believer was rarely expressed openly. Instead, it drove him further inward, intensifying a private spiritual crisis. Observers hostile to the movement recognized that this concealed transformation posed as great a challenge to tradition as any open rebellion. Works composed in the conventional style could nonetheless conceal profound shifts in meaning, revealing the depth of the tension within the religious world. A defining feature of this moderate position was the belief that the apostasy of the Messiah was unique and without parallel. The Messiah alone was destined to descend into the realm of impurity and dwell among forces opposed to holiness, while inwardly remaining faithful. For his followers, the paradox of this act was to be embraced in belief, but not imitated in practice. A boundary was drawn around this strange holiness, and crossing it was forbidden. The Messiah's actions, however troubling, were understood as belonging solely to his mission. Yet this boundary proved difficult to sustain. Among more fervent adherents, unrest began to grow. If the Messiah had entered the depths of evil in order to redeem it, could his followers remain passive? If all had shared in the initial awakening of redemption, why should they not participate actively in its completion? Gradually, a more radical impulse emerged, urging imitation rather than restraint. The call arose to follow the Messiah into the abyss, to confront impurity directly, and to overwhelm it with the force of holiness from within. Feelings of this kind formed the psychological background for the great nihilistic outbreak that arose within the radical wing of the Sabbatean movement. Its energy was sustained by intense religious emotion, yet at a decisive point these feelings merged with entirely different impulses, the forces of anarchy and lawlessness deeply embedded in the human psyche. Traditionally, Judaism had worked to suppress such tendencies, but in the revolutionary exhilaration associated with the experience of redemption and freedom, they re-emerged with unprecedented force. They were even surrounded by an aura of holiness, as though they too might ultimately undergo a form of tikkun, at least in the hind parts of holiness. At the same time, the disappointing course of outward events had a decisive impact. Although Sabbatai Zevi was imagined as possessing the heroic soul of a warrior like Bar Kokhba, he did not in fact rise to wage open battle on the day of divine intervention. A widening gap opened between inner experience and external reality, and once the inner realm was declared the truer one, the outer world increasingly lost its value. At precisely this point, messianic expectation shifted into nihilism. Deprived of political and historical realization, the new sense of freedom turned toward the sphere of moral life as its arena of expression. The psychology of the radical Sabbateans became deeply paradoxical and Morano-like. Its guiding principle was that whoever appears as he is cannot be a true believer. From this followed the idea that true faith cannot be publicly declared. It must remain concealed. Indeed, it was considered necessary to deny it outwardly, since it was likened to a seed planted in the soul that can only grow if first covered. On this basis, every Jew was in effect called upon to become a Morano. In a similar reversal, a true act could not be one performed openly before the world. Like true faith, it had to remain hidden, since only through concealment could it negate the falseness of what is openly displayed. A complete inversion of values thus took place. What had once been sacred became profane, and what had been profane acquired a new sanctity. It was no longer sufficient to devise new mystical intentions to match changed circumstances. New forms of action themselves were required. Before the coming of the Redeemer, inner intention and outward deed were aligned, allowing the performance of commandments to effect spiritual repair. After the Redeemer's advent, however, the two spheres were seen as standing in opposition. The inward commandment alone was now capable of producing tikkun, and it became identified with outward transgression. In this spirit it was declared, the nullification of the Torah is its true fulfillment. Above all, it was this claim regarding the hidden holiness of sin, often supported by isolating a Talmudic saying that a transgression done for its own sake is greater than a commandment not done for its own sake, that provoked outrage among ordinary believers and generated intense inner conflict even among adherents of the movement itself. In religious history, doctrines of the sanctity of sin typically appear in connection with spiritualistic sects. The pneumatic type of believer, living in a spiritual realm detached from ordinary social reality, is especially inclined toward such ideas. For such individuals, the world of spirit operates on a different plane from that of everyday human life, rendering conventional moral judgment irrelevant. Believing themselves to be beyond sin, they feel authorized to act according to spiritual impulse alone, even when this entails violating the norms of the surrounding society, and may even regard such violation as a duty in the name of higher revealed truth. Although tendencies of this kind had existed within Judaism earlier, particularly among the Kabbalists, they had remained on the level of theoretical speculation. Up to the emergence of the Sabbatean movement, such spiritualist inclinations did not take practical form. One of the clearest examples of this speculative current appears in the Sefer Hotamuna, a mystical work composed in early 13th-century Spain, which teaches that the Torah is constituted of spiritual letters that, while remaining essentially the same, appear differently in each cosmic aeon. Each aeon, or Shemitah, therefore possesses its own form of Torah. In the present aeon, governed by the divine quality of strict judgment, the Torah is understood in terms of commandments and prohibitions, and even its deepest mystical meanings are interpreted within that framework. In the aeon to come, however, ruled by divine mercy, it will be read differently, and it is even suggested that what is now forbidden may then be permitted. Everything depends on the aeon and the divine attribute that dominates it. While some Kabbalists, including Moses Cordovero, rejected such ideas as dangerous or unworthy, texts like the Sefer Hotamuna and the Sefer Harkana nevertheless exercised a strong influence on Sabbatean thought. To this doctrine of cosmic eons, the Sabbateans added another concept, originally independent of it. The Zohar itself does not employ the idea of Shemitot, meaning cycles or eons, a fact that later made it suspect among some Kabbalists. However, in later Zoharic writings such as the Tikkunei HaZohar and the Re'eh Mihemna, extensive discussion is found of four emanated worlds: the world of emanation, the world of creation, the world of formation, and the world of making, which together constitute the levels of spiritual reality. In this context, references also appear to a Torah of emanation and a Torah of creation, though their meaning is not entirely explicit. By the time of the Kabbalists of Seift, these expressions had acquired a more defined sense, referring to two aspects of the single Torah: the Torah as it is understood in the supernal world of emanation, and the Torah as it is understood in the lower world of creation. The Sabbateans took up this distinction and reinterpreted it through the doctrine of cosmic eons. The Torah of creation, they argued, borrowing a Zoharic image, is the Torah of the unredeemed world of exile, whose function is to serve as a garment for the Shekinah in her state of exile. One who observes its commandments is therefore understood as assisting in clothing the Shekinah in her suffering. The Torah of emanation, by contrast, is the true Torah, which, like the mystery of the Godhead it reveals, has remained concealed throughout the period of exile. With the beginning of redemption, it is now to be revealed. Although in essence it is identical with the Torah of creation, its mode of interpretation will change. All commandments and prohibitions of the lower Torah will be reinterpreted in the light of the world of emanation, in which, according to certain Kabbalistic traditions, no forbidden sexual restrictions exist. In this way, statements that had originated in an entirely different spiritual context were transformed by radical Sabbateans into slogans for a new moral order. The doctrine of the two Torahs became central to Sabbatean nihilism, not least because it aligned so closely with a Moroni-like mentality. The Torah of emanation, by its nature, was to be observed in secrecy, while the Torah of creation was to be openly violated. Yet how this violation was to be understood became a matter of dispute among the radicals, and different tendencies emerged. At its core, this development reflected a profound eruption of conflicting emotions. The structure that had bound the exilic Jewish soul was suddenly shattered, and a dizzying sense of liberation took hold of the individual. In this state, genuine impulses toward the sanctification of life became entangled with destructive and libidinal forces, all stirred from the depths by an overwhelming surge that oscillated between the earthly and the divine. The psychological factors involved were especially diverse in relation to the doctrine of the holiness of sin, which at first was restricted by some of the believers to the performance of specific acts alone, but, by its own inner logic, tended to expand until it encompassed more and more of the Mosaic law, particularly the biblical prohibitions. Among the leaders of the Dönmeh, the antinomian blessing attributed to Sabbatai Zevi, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who permits the forbidden," became a familiar saying. In practice, two partly contradictory justifications of antinomian behavior developed side by side. One view held that in the world of redemption sin no longer exists, therefore everything is holy and everything is permitted. The opposing view insisted instead on a total rejection of the world of creation, now understood as the entire structure of the old life and its institutions, and on the need to trample its values completely, since only by discarding its last remnants could true freedom be achieved. In Kabbalistic terms, one position advocated withholding the sparks of holiness from the kelapot until they withered from lack of sustenance, while the other demanded that the kelapot be filled with holiness until they collapsed under its pressure. Despite these differences and the psychological nuances surrounding the idea of transgression for its own sake and sacred sin, all radicals were united in the belief in the sanctifying power of sin itself, as expressed in their interpretation of the verse in Leviticus that speaks of the divine presence dwelling amid impurity. It would be mistaken to deny that the sexual dimension of this movement was extremely strong. A primitive release of impulses, long thought impossible after centuries of legal discipline, combined with deeply distorted drives in search of ideological justification. In light of this, it is not surprising that 18th-century rabbinic excommunications already described the children of believers as illegitimate, nor that later generations sought to conceal their ancestry as far as possible. At the same time, it is reasonable to accept the observation of Zalman Rubashov in his study of the Frankists, who noted that every sect is accused by its opponents of the worst forms of immorality, leading to the suggestion that such accusations often reflect more the fantasies of the accusers than the actual behavior of the accused. Rubashov himself argued that while the conduct of the Frankists was sufficient to provoke indignation and astonishment, it was also likely exaggerated. However, In the case of the radical Sabbateans, there was little need for exaggeration. As Gershom Scholem observed in a note to Kraushaar's History of Frankism, even if anti-Sabbatean accusations appear fantastic or biased, there is no reason to doubt their essential accuracy, since they are supported by the confessions of the believers themselves as well as by their own apologetic writings in both theoretical and homiletical form. This conclusion has been reinforced by a later discovery. For many years, well into modern times, the Sabbateans of Salonika, the Dönmeh, continued to celebrate on the 22nd day of the Hebrew month of Adar a festival known as the Festival of the Lamb, the meaning of which was kept secret until younger members of the sect eventually disclosed it. According to their testimony, the celebration included an orgiastic ritual known as the extinguishing of the lights. This rite most likely originated in Izmir, as both its name and its form appear to derive from an ancient pagan cult of the Great Mother, which survived in modified form in Asia Minor among a small sect known as the Light Extinguishers, operating under Islamic cover. The Dönmeh appear to have adopted this ancient bacchanalian practice, rooted in archaic myth, and adapted it to their own mystical belief in the sacred value of exchanging wives, a practice also attributed to other radical groups within the movement. The history of Sabbatean nihilism as a mass movement, rather than as the concern of a few isolated Jewish scholars who donned the fez like Sabbatai Zevi, began in the year 1683, when several hundred Jewish families in Salonika converted to Islam in order to conquer the Caliphate from within. From this point onward, organized Sabbatean nihilism appeared in four main forms. First, there were the believers who adopted a form of voluntary Marianism through conversion to Islam. Research on the Dönmeh, especially the studies of Abraham Danan and Solomon Rosanes, shows that the sect was internally entirely Jewish, not in the rabbinic sense but as a mystical heresy. This apostasy provoked strong opposition among the moderates, for reasons already indicated. Second, there were the believers who remained outwardly faithful Jews while inwardly adhering to the Torah of emanation. Such groups existed in the Balkans and in Palestine, beginning with the arrival of Hayyim Malak, and later, in the 18th century, in northern and eastern Europe. They were especially concentrated in Podolia and in nearby towns such as Buxax, Busk, Gliniani, Horodenka, Zolciu, Zlokso, Tismanitsia, Nadwerna, Podhaj, Rohatyn and Satanov, as well as in other regions, particularly Romania, Hungary and Moravia. Third, there were the Frankists who Maronized themselves through conversion to Catholicism. Fourth, there were Frankist groups in Bohemia, Moravia, Hungary and Romania who chose to remain within Judaism. Despite these differences, all four groups were understood as parts of a single larger entity. Since all radicals held that external behavior did not indicate true belief, apostasy was not considered a dividing factor. A Jew in the Prague ghetto who publicly observed the commandments of the Torah of creation, while privately violating them, knew that a believer in Warsaw or Offenbach who had been baptized for mystical reasons was still his spiritual brother. Likewise, Sabbateans in Northern Europe had maintained close contact with the Dönmeh in Salonika even after their conversion to Islam. In essence, the radicals shared a common intellectual world, and their views on the Torah, the Messiah, and the mystery of the Godhead remained fundamentally identical, even when expressed in different forms among the Frankists. The systematic violation of the Torah of creation was regarded by radical Sabbateans as the central sign of the new epoch inaugurated by Sabbatai Zevi. Yet a fundamental difficulty arose. How could one distinguish between what belonged to the lower world of creation and its Torah, and what belonged to the higher world of emanation and its Torah? On this point, opinions diverged. Baruchia Russo, known as Berahia or Barokia, leader of the radical wing of the Dönmeh in the early 18th century, taught that even the 36 transgressions punishable by karet, cutting off from Israel and from God, including all forbidden sexual acts, belonged only to the Torah of creation. In the same spirit, it was declared permissible to eat the sinew of the thigh vein, since with the coming of the Messiah, Jacob's thigh had been restored. Some, drawing on a passage in the Zohar, argued that abstaining from the sinew of the thigh vein and fasting on Tisha B'Av were interconnected. As long as fasting on Tisha B'Av remained obligatory, so too was abstention from the sinew. When fasting on that day was lifted, the prohibition would also cease. Others went further still, asserting that with the advent of the Messiah the Torah had been annulled, and that in the future it would be read without reference to the commandments. They claimed that the violation of the Torah had become its fulfillment, illustrating this with the image of a grain of wheat that must decay in the earth before it can sprout. In this view, just as a grain of wheat must rot before growth becomes possible, so the actions of the believers had to become corrupt in appearance in order to bring forth redemption. This metaphor, widely circulated, captured the essence of Sabbatean psychology. In the transitional period, while redemption remained concealed, the explicit form of the Torah had to be negated, so that it too might enter concealment and ultimately be renewed. There were, however, even more extreme cases than these. Jacob Emden recounts how he was told by a learned rabbinical colleague, the rabbi of the Amsterdam Ashkenazim, that during his time in Zolkyu, he became involved with a heretic named Fischel of Zlokso. This man was deeply versed in the entire Talmud, which he knew almost by heart, having the habit of shutting himself away in his room to study it continuously, without interruption and without idle conversation, despite being a wealthy man. He would extend his prayers to twice the length of the early Hasidim, and was regarded by all as an exceptionally pious and ascetic figure. On one occasion he came to Emden's informant to confess his sins, and revealed that he belonged to the sect of Sabbatai Zevi. He admitted that he had eaten leavened bread during Passover and other violations, while speaking in a contrite manner as though genuinely repentant. Soon afterward, however, he was discovered committing serious transgressions of the law, and was excommunicated by the rabbis of Lithuania and Volhynia. When questioned as to why he had not continued his hidden sins privately instead of exposing himself through public transgression, he replied that, on the contrary, the greater the shame he was forced to endure for his faith, the better it was. Here the most paradoxical form of the believer is revealed, and significantly, this individual was not an ignorant man but an acknowledged rabbinic scholar, affirmed as such by a competent authority. This provides a striking example of the nihilistic rejection of the Torah of creation, which in this case was studied precisely in order to be violated in spirit. The Jewish world, it is suggested, was already showing signs of inner breakdown if such types could find a place within it so easily. Yet beneath these distortions there remained an underlying longing for something positive that, lacking proper conditions, had failed to come to realization. Parables and homilies were also employed to illustrate the doctrine of the sacred sin, and it becomes clear that they are more than merely paradoxical or offensive sayings. They express a new spiritual orientation. It was said that the patriarchs came into the world to repair the senses and succeeded in restoring 4 of them, while Sabbatai Zevi restored the 5th, the sense of touch, which Aristotle and Maimonides had regarded as a source of shame, but which was now elevated to honor and glory. Even at the beginning of the 19th century, a fervent believer in Prague interpreted the verse in Psalm 68, "Thou hast ascended on high, thou hast led captivity captive," as referring to the spiritual Torah of emanation, described as a captive because it had been seized by Moses and forced to reside within the prison of the material Torah of creation. In this interpretation, the inner Torah is in opposition to the outer. The outer must be annihilated before the inner can be released. He further explains this through a series of symbolic analogies, such as a woman from the lands of Ishmael feeling liberated when she comes to the lands of Edom. In the same way, living within Israel under the Torah of creation is described as a form of captivity, and marriage is not possible under that order. Only within Edom is union possible, while in Israel one must remain a virgin, a statement left for those who understand to interpret. The cryptic Frankist references to Christianity and to virginity remain obscure, yet they reflect how strongly the rejection of the lower, material Torah of creation persisted among Sabbatean Jews even in the later stages of the movement. Elsewhere, the same author, a deeply religious thinker, reinterprets the verse stating that no harm befalls the righteous to mean that, from the perspective of the Torah of emanation, the righteous are justified in all their actions, however sinful they may appear externally. He then offers further mystical explanations for the necessity of certain transgressions, such as eating on fast days, arguing that fasting functions as a kind of spiritual bribe offered to the Kelapot and is therefore incompatible with the pure spiritual nature of the Torah of emanation. At the ultimate stage of apostasy, the arguments advanced by the radicals in its defense closely resemble those used by the moderates to justify the apostasy of Sabbatai Zevi himself. A revealing document concerning the disputes among the believers survives in the form of a homily by the Sabbatean Nehemiah Haon on the verse from Deuteronomy, warning lest there be among the people a man, woman, family, or tribe whose heart turns away from the Lord to serve the gods of the nations, and lest there be a root producing gall and wormwood. In the conclusion of his long discourse, Haon presents a paradoxical resolution that reflects the deep confusion and inner conflict of those Sabbateans unable to decide between radical and moderate positions. According to this view, the Caliper will either wither into nothing, or it will become so saturated with holiness that, because of this excess, it must be expelled. From this premise, he derives the idea that redemption can be brought about in two opposite ways, either in a generation entirely guiltless, when Israel has extracted all sparks of holiness from the Caliper, or in a generation entirely guilty, when the Caliper becomes so full of holiness that it bursts and perishes. From this reasoning arose the mistaken conclusion held by some that one might worship other gods in order to fill the Caliper to the point of destruction. Against this, Haon insists that one must not reason that, since it is impossible for all to become guiltless and thus extract holiness properly, it is better to sin deliberately in order to hasten redemption by destroying the Caliper from within. Rather, one must wait for the Lord and keep his way, enduring exile rather than committing sin in order to force salvation. He then interprets the warning about a root bearing gall and wormwood as referring to the one who, upon hearing the curse, turns his heart away from God while simultaneously blessing himself inwardly. Such a person accepts the truth of the divine command, but assumes that if his intentions remain pure, and if he seeks to quench the Caliper by giving it holiness so that it will die, then no harm will come to him. He is convinced that, since his aim is good, God will transform the curse into a blessing. It is precisely about such a person that it is said the Lord will not be willing to pardon him. Even if his intention is to hasten redemption, he cannot be forgiven. The principle that a transgression committed for its own sake may outweigh a commandment done without proper intention does not apply here, since that principle concerns ordinary sins, whereas here the issue is the worship of other gods. Those who adopt this mistaken reasoning are unable to destroy the Caliper. Instead, they become trapped within it, which is why the text emphasizes that they will not be pardoned. Another interpretation is also offered. When Moses declares that the Lord will not pardon such a person, it is not a curse, but a recognition of spiritual incapacity. The sinner believes in his heart that his actions will not be judged as sins but rewarded, and therefore he is incapable of repentance, since he does not acknowledge wrongdoing. Each act of sin only increases divine anger, because he interprets his transgression as righteousness and assumes that the greater his sin, the closer redemption becomes. Such a person fully incurs the force of the curse. The phrase that the Lord will separate him for evil from all the tribes of Israel is thus understood as indicating that one who deliberately brings about evil is isolated in judgment, since no one can commit a transgression on behalf of another, and therefore his actions cannot be attributed to the community as a whole. Yet a further interpretation softens this conclusion. If such a person, despite his sin, ultimately repents completely, then even his passage through the realm of the Caliper may result in the raising of many sparks. Just as a body expels not only a harmful substance but everything associated with it, so too repentance may expel and elevate all that was absorbed in sin. Nevertheless, this possibility does not justify placing oneself in danger, for such outcomes are not constant or assured. Finally, the separation of the sinner unto evil is understood to mean that he is singled out for judgment, since evil actions cannot be performed on behalf of the community. However, if he repents fully and raises up sparks through repentance, then all Israel shares in the good that results, even though they do not share in the evil he committed. It is likely that this entire passage has an autobiographical foundation. In any case, the attitude of its author toward the voluntary Moranos, whose conversion is criticized yet also deeply understood, is not hostile or vengeful. One of the strongest forces in the formation of a nihilistic mentality among the radicals was their effort to deny an objective historical order in which exile continued in full force while the beginnings of redemption were perceived only by the believers themselves. At that time, this hostility toward external reality remained confined to the religious sphere, since the social world of ghetto Jewry was still stable enough to prevent its political transformation. Before the French Revolution, there was no real connection between Sabbatean ideas and the growing undercurrent of dissatisfaction with the ancien regime in Europe. Only when changing times expanded the horizons of the believers and revealed more concrete means of influencing historical development than the violation of the Torah of Beriah did they begin to imagine the possibility of transforming society itself. In this sense, it represented a return of a political dimension to Jewish messianism, which had been reshaped almost beyond recognition by the Sabbatean movement. As long as external conditions did not allow it, even the radicals lacked political awareness and could only imagine the renewal of Jewish life through the subversion of its most sacred values. Yet once the historical moment became favorable, this worldly dimension of Jewish messianism, which Sabbateanism had tried to suppress, re-emerged with new force. This issue would later become important. However, attention is first turned to another expression of the paradoxical dialectic of Sabbatean thought, its attitude toward the land of Israel. Immediately after the collapse of the first messianic expectations surrounding Sabbatai Zevi, scattered Sabbatean groups expressed opposition to emigration to the Holy Land. Nathan of Gaza himself held that, for the time being, it was better not to go to the land of Israel. However, this view was not universally accepted. Especially after the year 2100, certain believers attempted to justify emigration through mystical arguments, claiming that Sabbatean doctrine actually supported it. Groups associated with Abraham Rovigo, as well as the circle of Judah Hasid, eventually settled in the land of Israel under the influence of such ideas. One widespread belief held that at Sabbatai Zevi's second manifestation, occurring 40 years after his concealment, true knowledge of his nature would be revealed only to those followers residing in the Holy Land. Sabbatean nihilists such as Hayim Malak also supported migration there, expecting special revelations and perhaps also considering that violating the Torah of Beriah would be most significant precisely on the holiest ground, in the sense of conquering the queen in her own house. Even in the middle of the 18th century, Sabbatean nihilists in Podolia maintained contacts in the land of Israel, while emissaries sent from the Jewish community there included Sabbatean scholars who acted both as secret propagators of the doctrine and as intermediaries among dispersed believers. Some, including the author of the Book of the Adornment of Days, described in detail the life of a Kabbalistic devotee throughout the year and were likely moderate in their outlook, though the positions of many others remain uncertain. By the middle of the 18th century, however, a reversal had taken place, and a clear anti-Palestinian tendency appeared within the movement. Whether the anti-Palestinian sermon preserved by Jacob Emden in Edith Birakov is truly the work of Jonathan Iberskites remains uncertain, but it cannot be dismissed as fabrication, since similar ideas appear in other Sabbatean sources unavailable to Emden. Among the Frankists, a striking ideology of Jewish territorialism emerged at this time, distinct from Palestine-centered aspirations, apparently influenced by Frank's own ambitions. Thus, on the eve of its encounter with new political ideas, Sabbatean nihilism reversed its earlier positive valuation of the land of Israel. When it later began to adopt a renewed political messianism and to speak of the rebirth of the Jewish nation within a global revolution, the land of Israel itself no longer held central significance. As stated by a Frankist writer in Prague, already cited earlier, the exile of Israel is not a punishment for sin but part of a cosmic plan aimed at the destruction of the Kelopot throughout the world, so that even the return of many thousands of Jews to the land of Israel would not complete the process. According to the same author, this doctrine of exile was a hidden mystical principle unknown to earlier sages until its recent revelation in Poland. Thus, in the final phase of Sabbateanism, the meaning of exile itself was reinterpreted in an entirely new way. The figure of Sabbatai Zevi himself was also transformed over time, becoming entirely mythic in character. Gradually, the historical element in his life was diminished until nothing remained but a legendary hero said to have inaugurated a new epoch in world history. Even during his lifetime, one of his earliest disciples, Abraham Yakini, could already write in his book Vevi Ha'amudim that just as one of the 70 faces of the Torah concerns entirely the resurrection of the dead, as seen in passages of the Zohar on several chapters of the Pentateuch, while other allusions remain inaccessible due to human intellectual limitation, So another of the 70 faces of the Torah concerns entirely the Messiah, our Lord and Master, whose greatness would soon be revealed, enabling a fuller understanding of the Torah in this messianic sense. It is therefore not surprising that the concrete historical figure of Sabbatai Zevi was transformed by his followers in a manner similar to, and in some respects even more extreme than, the transformation of Jesus in Christian tradition, since his evolution into a mythic being became especially complete. Like early Christians, the radicals eventually came to hold that the Messiah was not merely a superior human figure, but an incarnation of God in human form. This doctrine of the mystery of the Godhead was accepted across radical groups down to the final Frankist circles, and was regarded as the deepest truth of their mystical teaching. The origin of this idea cannot be determined with certainty. It may have arisen from the collective memory of thousands of Marranos, from Christian writings or anti-Christian polemics, or from the inner paradox experienced by believers confronted with the idea of an apostate Messiah, leading them to resolve the contradiction through the concept of divine incarnation, much as the paradox of a crucified Messiah shaped another Jewish response to religious crisis. It is also possible that all of these influences acted together. The doctrine of an incarnate God, which immediately became a point of conflict between radicals and moderates within Sabbatean circles, was initially restricted to Sabbatai Zevi himself. According to one formulation, at the onset of redemption the Holy One, blessed be He, withdrew upward, while Sabbatai Zevi ascended to become God in his place. Since in Sabbatean usage, the Holy One, blessed be He, was identical with the God of Israel, this meant that Sabbatai Zevi assumed divine status as the Holy King. Soon, however, believers in Salonika replaced this view with another, that the Holy King himself had become incarnate in the Messiah in order to restore the world and annul the Torah of Beriah. In this form, the doctrine was accepted by Sabbatean nihilists in Podolia. A surviving prayer from them expresses the hope for devotion to the divine commandments, while also asking for purification of thought, so that even transgressive acts within the Torah of Atzilut are directed toward the divine name, addressing the Holy Lord. The living Messiah who once lived in the earthly world annulled the Torah of Beriah, and then returned to his place to govern all worlds. This teaching of a single incarnation did not remain fixed. Among Sephardic converts to Islam there arose the belief that the leaders of the believers in every generation were reincarnations of Sabbatai Zevi. Whether this implied that such leaders, especially Baruchia, a major transmitter of the doctrine, were regarded as divine incarnations equal to the Messiah is not entirely certain. However, there is strong reason to think that the early message of Jacob Frank was based on this Sephardic teaching, modified to suit his own character, and that Frank himself, though never stating it directly, was understood by his followers to imply that he was the living God once again incarnated on earth. The Frankists, in a consistent though striking formulation, divided the three divine hypostases into separate incarnations. Sabbatai Zevi, whom Frank called the First One, was identified with the ancient Holy One. Frank himself embodied the Holy King, and the third hypostasis, the Shekinah, known in Kabbalistic terminology as the Kingdom, the Lady, the Maiden, and the Doe, was to appear as a woman. This introduced the idea of a female Messiah, referred to by Frank as the Virgin, who would complete the work of redemption. This innovation is difficult to separate from the influence of contemporary mystical Christian sects in Eastern Europe, which spoke of a triadic structure of saviors corresponding to the divine nature, and included a feminine incarnation of divine wisdom or spirit. The Frankists were even closely connected with one such group, the Philippovicites in Romania and Ukraine, whose former leader defended them publicly before the Catholic authorities in Poland. Interpreted in this way, redemption appears as a process permeated by incarnations of the divinity. Even the radicals in Prague, who remained attached to their Jewish identity and attempted to defend their beliefs through Jewish concepts and sources, were drawn toward this understanding. Although their hostility toward Christianity as an institution was absolute, references to the mystery of the Incarnation appear throughout their writings. The anti-Sabbatean polemicists who accused the believers of attributing corporeality to God were, in fact, correct in their observation. Yet what appeared to them as a damaging confession was, for their opponents, a source of pride. As one believer expressed it, because the Godhead has a body, the sting of death is removed. On the surface, the extreme spirituality associated with the world of Absolute and the longing for divine embodiment expressed in the doctrine of messianic incarnation seem to be opposing tendencies. Yet beneath both lies the attempt of a new religious sensibility to express itself through inherited theological language. In such a situation, paradox becomes the only possible resolution. In summary, the principal doctrines of radical Sabbateanism may be stated as follows. First, the belief that the Messiah must necessarily apostatize and that his descent into the realm of the Kelapot has a sacramental character. Second, the belief that the believer must not appear outwardly as he truly is. Third, the belief that the Torah of Atzilut is to be fulfilled precisely through the violation of the Torah of Beriah. Fourth, the belief that the first cause and the God of Israel are not identical, the former belonging to philosophical rationalism, the latter to religion. Fifth, the belief in three hypostases of the Godhead, each of which has been or will be embodied in human form. These doctrines, it is argued, demonstrate that in the further development of the Sabbatean movement, the structure of traditional Judaism was irreparably shattered. Among those who participated in this radical destruction of inherited values, a new openness to novel ideas inevitably emerged. One may well ask how long such energies, once released, could remain without direction, and whether life was to be governed indefinitely by paradox alone. Yet, just as the character of the Sabbatean movement was shaped by the circumstances of its origin, so too its decline was determined by the same forces. As the believers sought to draw forth sparks of holiness from the Kelapot, they instead found themselves lost in the darkest of impasses, and as they intended to engage with the other side of existence, they became entangled within it. Finally, and most ironically, those who had hastened to assist the Redeemer, seeking to act as he acted, since strange are his deeds, and to worship as he worships, were ultimately led into the hands of a figure such as Jacob Frank. Jacob Frank, 1726 to 1791, will always be remembered as one of the most disturbing phenomena in all Jewish history. A religious leader who, whether from self-interested motives or otherwise, acted in ways marked by corruption and moral degeneration. It could even be argued that the Sabbatean movement, in order to exhaust its seemingly endless potential for contradiction and unpredictability, required precisely such a figure, someone capable of extinguishing its remaining inner light and corrupting whatever trace of truth and goodness still survived within the labyrinthine ruins of the believer's inner world. Even if the doctrine of the sacred sin, the mitzvah habia be'avra, contained certain insights, these were entirely degraded once they came into contact with Frank's personality. Yet, just as the believers had chosen a path on which everything became permissible, it may have been precisely this extreme openness that drew them to him. Here was a man who dared to go to the end, to take the final step into the abyss, to drain the cup of ruin and destruction until every remaining spark of holiness was turned into mockery. His followers, though less extreme than he in this respect, were captivated by his fearlessness, which was untouched by either fear of God or fear of damnation, and they regarded him as a true saint, a new Sabbatai Zevi, and an incarnate divinity. Yet even after accounting for Frank's opportunism, calculated deception, and personal ambition, matters that are not central here, he remains a figure of immense, if satanic, power. His promises and prophetic schemes for a future following a general catastrophe do not appear especially compelling today, though his territorialist vision at least reveals both his drive for power and, in a distorted form, the desire among his followers for the reconstruction of Jewish national and economic life. Despite the negativity of his teachings, they still contained a kind of lived creed. Frank was a nihilist, and his nihilism had a rare authenticity. Its primitive violence is indeed terrifying. He was uneducated and repeatedly emphasized his lack of learning. Yet despite this, precisely here lies the essential point. He appears as a powerful, authoritarian spirit living in the middle of the 18th century while immersed entirely in a self-created mythological universe. From the ideas of radical Sabbateanism, in which he was apparently raised, Frank constructed an entire myth of religious nihilism. This alone is remarkable. He was not an original speculative thinker, but he possessed a striking talent for vivid, concise, and symbolically concrete expression. Even in their nihilistic content, his sayings in the sayings of the Lord resemble in form those of later Hasidic masters, and despite his tyrannical character, he possessed a hidden poetic impulse that becomes even more striking in light of his habitual brutality. Even Kraushaar, who emphasized the incoherent and grotesque elements in Frank's recorded sayings, was forced to admit that they occasionally display vigor and imagination. It is difficult to see how a sensitive reader who engages seriously with the excerpts published by Kraushaar could remain unaffected by them. Frank was especially gifted in creating new images and symbols, and despite their popular tone, his expressions are often filled with mystical undertones. He rarely used traditional Kabbalistic terminology, and even criticized Sabbatean groups in Podolia for their continued attachment to Kabbalah, which he called madness. Yet anyone familiar with radical Sabbatean thought can still recognize its presence beneath his new vocabulary. In place of the familiar Sabbatean three knots of faith, one now finds expressions such as the good God, the big brother who stands before the Lord, and the virgin, terms striking in their earthy immediacy. The Kelipa, the Torah of Beriah and the Torah of Atzilut, the sparks of holiness, and the entire conceptual vocabulary of Sabbatean theology disappear and are replaced by an entirely exoteric language. Even the figure of Sabbatai Zevi is greatly diminished in importance. The world of Sabbateanism itself, however, remains intact, or rather reaches its final stage, where it approaches self-annihilation. In this following section, the aim is to present a general account of Frank's religious teachings, insofar as they can be reconstructed from his numerous sayings, and in the form they appear to have reached only after his conversion to Catholicism. Although individual elements sometimes seem contradictory, they are largely internally consistent. The dark character of their world, or more precisely, their vision of world ruin, did not allow for great variation, though it nevertheless attracted even traditional believers, including those in Prague, who found a disturbing fascination in its message. Frank himself summarized this attitude in a blunt statement: "It is one thing to worship God, and quite another to follow the path that I have taken." According to Frank, the cosmos, Tevel, or earthly world, Tevel Har-Gashmi, as it was termed among sectarians in Salonika, is not the creation of the good or living God. If it were, it would be external to him and humanity would be immortal. Yet the presence of death proves that this is not the case. There do exist worlds belonging to the good God, but these are concealed and accessible only to the believers. Within them dwell divine powers, among whom is the King of Kings, also called the Big Brother, and he who stands before the Lord. By contrast, the evil power that fashioned the cosmos and introduced death is associated with the feminine principle and is most likely composed of three gods, or rulers of the world, one of whom is the angel of death. These rulers, each of whom has taken human form on earth, obstruct the path toward the good God, who remains unknown to humanity. No mystical knowledge of him has yet been revealed, nor has the holy soul, Nishmata, that emanates from him entered any being, not even Sabbatai Zevi. In the present age there are three rulers of the world: life, wealth, and death, the last of which is destined to be replaced by wisdom, though this transformation is exceedingly difficult. Wisdom, in some mysterious way, is linked to the good God, yet even so he cannot yet reveal himself to humanity, since the world remains bound by laws that are not good. It is therefore necessary to break free from the rule of these laws, which are laws of death and harmful to mankind. To accomplish this, the good God has sent messengers into the world, including the patriarchs who dug wells, Moses, Jesus, and others. Moses indicated the true path, but it proved too difficult, and he therefore introduced another religion, giving humanity the law of Moses, whose commandments are ultimately harmful and without value. By contrast, the law of the Lord, the spiritual Torah of the Sabbateans, is perfect, Psalm 19, verse 8, though no human being has yet attained it. Finally, the good God sent Sabbatai Zevi into the world, but he too was unable to accomplish his mission because he could not discover the true path. Yet Frank declares, "My desire is to lead you toward life." Still, the way to life is not simple. It is the path of nihilism, requiring the abandonment of all laws, conventions, and religions, the adoption of every possible stance and its rejection in turn, and the following of the leader step by step into the abyss. Baptism becomes necessary, as Frank stated before his conversion, because Christianity has paved the way for us. Decades later, the same Christian would declare, "Christ, as you know, said that he had come to redeem the world from the hands of the devil, but I have come to redeem it from all the laws and customs that have ever existed. It is my task to annihilate all this so that the good God can reveal himself." The annihilation of every religion and every positive system of belief is presented as the true way that the believers are expected to follow. In Frank's imagination, the redemptive force of destruction knows no limits. He declares that wherever Adam walked, cities were built, but wherever he himself steps, all will be destroyed, since he came into the world only to destroy and annihilate, yet what he builds will endure forever. Humanity is described as engaged in an uncompromising war against the no-good laws that govern existence. In this struggle, he insists that all who wish to be warriors must be without religion, attaining freedom through their own power and grasping the tree of life. No part of the human soul can remain outside this conflict. Ascension requires prior descent. As he says, no one can climb a mountain without first descending to its base. Therefore one must descend to the lowest level, for only then can one rise toward the infinite. This is identified as the mystical principle of Jacob's ladder, which he claims to have seen in the form of a V. He further states that he did not come into the world to raise people up, but to cast them down into the abyss. Beyond this point no further descent is possible, and ascent cannot be achieved through human strength alone, since only the Lord can lift one from the depths by his hand. This descent into the abyss requires not only rejection of all religions and conventions, but also the performance of strange acts, together with the voluntary humiliation of the self, so that libertinism and a state of absolute shamelessness become identical with the tikkun, the rectification of the soul. All are now obliged to enter the abyss in which every law and religion is annihilated. Yet the path is dangerous, for there are powers and gods, identified with the three rulers of the world, that block the way. These must be bypassed in order to proceed, something no figure of the past was able to accomplish, neither Solomon, nor Jesus, nor even Sabbatai Zevi. To overcome these opposing forces, which are equated with the gods of other religions, one must remain perfectly silent and even use deception. This is described as the mystical principle of the burden of silence, Mossa Duma, a form of restraint required of the believer, echoing the earlier Sabbatean demand not to appear as one truly is. This principle becomes the essence of the true way itself. A fortress is not taken by speech, but by direct action, and therefore one must proceed in silence. It is better to see than to speak, since the heart must not reveal its knowledge to the mouth. No place remains for scholars here, only for the burden of silence. At the moment of baptism in Lvov, he is reported to have said, "Thus far, all is well. From here onward, silence must be carried as a burden, and speech must be restrained." The ancestors spoke constantly, yet achieved nothing. By contrast, this path requires silence and endurance, and this is precisely why it is called a burden. One who moves from place to place must keep silent, as in drawing a bow. The longer the breath is held, the farther the arrow flies. From the abyss, if the burden of silence is properly borne, holy knowledge will emerge. The task is therefore to acquire knowledge, and the passage to it lies in a form of combination with the nations, though without merging with them. Whoever reaches the destination will live in anarchic freedom. The place toward which this path leads tolerates no laws, since all law belongs to death, whereas the journey is toward life. This place is called Edom or Esau, and the way toward it, followed through the depths of the abyss, under the guidance of knowledge and the burden of silence, is named the way to Esau. It is the path already prefigured by Jacob the patriarch, the first Jacob, whose deeds anticipated those of the last Jacob, Jacob Frank. Even Esau himself is understood as prefigured in Scripture, though only in concealed form. Esau, son of Jacob, is described as merely the curtain before the entrance to the king's inner chamber. Herein lies the mystical principle of the wells dug by the patriarchs, as well as the hidden meaning of the narrative in Genesis, in which Jacob arrives at a well already prepared, rolls away the stone from its opening, and encounters Rachel together with her father Laban. Another figure who is said to have found access to Esau is the sorcerer Balaam. Esau belongs to the realm of the good God, where the power of death is annulled, and it is also the dwelling place of the Virgin, who is called Rachel in the biblical account of Jacob and elsewhere described as the beautiful maiden who has no eyes. She is identified as the true Messiah, who, contrary to traditional belief, cannot be a man. To her all the weapons of the king are surrendered, for she is also the sought-after divine wisdom, or Sophia, destined to replace death as one of the three rulers of the world. For the present, however, she remains concealed within a fortress, hidden from all living beings. All the strange acts, which far surpass even the strange fire offered before the Lord by the sons of Aaron, are undertaken solely for the purpose of reaching her. She is also described as the holy serpent guarding the garden, and anyone who asks what the serpent is doing in paradise merely reveals his own ignorance. The place of Esau, the abode of the Virgin and of true salvation, has not yet been attained by anyone. Yet its concealed light will ultimately be revealed to the believers, who will have the honor of becoming its soldiers and fighting on its behalf. These are among the central elements of Frank's teaching, a genuine myth of religious nihilism, formed by a figure who did not inhabit the world of rational discourse, but instead lived entirely within a universe of mythological beings. From the perspective of the history of religion, it might even appear more plausible that this concerns an antinomian myth from the 2nd century, created by nihilistic Gnostics such as Carpocrates and his followers, than that it was actually taught and believed by Polish Jews on the eve of the French Revolution, among whom neither master nor disciples had any awareness that they were reviving an ancient tradition. Not only the overall structure of thought, but even certain symbols and expressions coincide. Yet this is less surprising than it may first appear, when one considers that the Gnostics of antiquity, no less than the Frankists, developed their doctrines within a biblical framework, even while radically inverting its values. They too regarded Esau and Balaam as worshippers of the good God. They too transformed the serpent of Eden into a symbol of gnosis, salvation, and divine wisdom guiding humanity toward liberation from the evil rule of the demiurge by commanding disobedience to his laws. And they too maintained that the law of the good and alien God, which demanded strange acts, stood in direct opposition to the law of Moses, understood as the legislation of the wrathful Creator. Frank's ultimate vision of the future rests upon the still unrevealed laws of the Torah of Atzilut, which he promised would become effective once his followers had come to Esau, meaning once the passage through the abyss, with its complete destruction and negation, had been fully accomplished. In attempting to clarify this doctrine of libertinism, it is useful to cite a passage from the philosopher Hans Jonas's study of Gnosticism, where he describes the emergence of a libertinist ethic among the nihilistically inclined pneumatics of the 2nd century. In this account, the moral outlook of these pneumatics is marked by a revolutionary spirit that extends into practice. It involves a total and explicit rejection of traditional norms of conduct, combined with an extreme sense of freedom that interprets the license to act without restraint as both proof of authenticity and a gift granted from above. The doctrine rests on the idea of an extra spirit as a privilege bestowed upon a new type of human being, who is no longer bound by the customary obligations and laws. In contrast to the ordinary psychic individual, the pneumatic is conceived as a free person, liberated from the demands of the law, and whose unrestrained conduct is not merely a negative revolt but a positive realization of this freedom. Such moral nihilism is understood as expressing a deeper crisis of a world in transition. By asserting absolute freedom and even glorifying the sacredness of transgression, the self attempts to fill the void created in the interval between two opposing systems of law. Characteristic of this atmosphere are hostility toward established norms, the tendency to define oneself in opposition to the majority of humanity, and the urge to defy the authority of divine powers understood as world rulers and guardians of the old moral order. Beyond simple rejection of the past, there is also a drive to insult its custodians and to rebel openly against them. This represents revolution without philosophical disguise, which is why the gospel of libertinism stands at the center of the Gnostic upheaval in religious thought. At the same time, there is often an element of reckless daring, which the Gnostic presents as evidence of trust in his own spiritual nature. Across all revolutionary periods, human beings are drawn to the intoxication of extreme expressions and grand declarations. All of this applies directly to radical Sabbateanism in general and to the Frankist movement in particular. The mentality described by Jonas could hardly find a more extreme expression than in Frank's nihilistic myth. It must be noted, however, that myth and historical reality do not always coincide. In the case of the Frankists, the myth was undoubtedly more extreme than actual practice, although Frank himself was not far from enacting it, as suggested by the manuscript of the Chronicles of the Life of the Lord, which was once accessible to Kraushaar through a Frankist family but later disappeared. In any case, the crucial point is that such a myth arose at all, and that a significant number of ghetto Jews came to see in it a path toward political and spiritual liberation, to use the words of the educated Frankist Gabriel Porges in Prague when he later described the movement's aims to his son after Frank's death. For those who found in Frankism an answer to their personal struggles and questions, the world of Judaism had already been completely shattered, even if they themselves did not follow the true way, and may in fact have outwardly continued to live as the most observant of Jews. It will apparently never be known with certainty why most Sabbatean groups in Podolia followed Frank's leadership and converted to Catholicism, while their counterparts in Western Europe, who likewise regarded Frank as their spiritual guide, chose to remain within Judaism. Knowledge in this area, which is essential for understanding Jewish history in these regions, remains extremely limited, and only speculation is possible. One possible explanation lies in the differing social structures of the two groups. The majority of Sabbateans in Podolia belonged to the lower social strata, and only a small number of those who converted were educated individuals. By contrast, the Sabbateans in Germany and the Austro-Hungarian lands were generally wealthier and included many with significant rabbinic learning. As is often the case with religious sects, Sabbateanism was transmitted through entire families rather than isolated individuals. Even today, records show that several families, some of them prominent, already identified with Sabbatean allegiance around the year 1740, were still adhering to the Holy Faith more than 6 decades later. For such circles, traditional Judaism functioned as a permanent external covering for deeper convictions, although views differed regarding the precise nature of this duality. Not all of them followed Frank, even though the Frankists in Prague were the most spiritually influential among them and actively spread their ideas. It is likely that former disciples of Rabbi Jonathan Eberschutz also belonged to this broader milieu. In any case, the number of actual conversions within these groups remained very small. Many may have aspired to attain the holy gnosis of Edom, but few were prepared to enter Christianity in order to reach it. In general, however, after Frank's death, the surviving Sabbatean groups continued to develop along roughly parallel lines. 4 main documents from this final stage have been preserved: the Book of the Prophecy of Isaiah, written by an apostate believer in Offenbach, a long sermon on the Alanu prayer published by Wesley from a Frankist manuscript, several Frankist letters transmitted in summary by Peter Beer, and a commentary on En Yaakov that came into the possession of Dr. H. Brodie during his time as chief rabbi of Prague. All these sources reflect a shared intellectual world, differing mainly in tone. The first praises baptism and issues prophetic curses against the Jewish people and its leaders, while the others, written by Jews, remain silent on such matters. In the same collection containing the commentary on En Yaakov, there is also a Frankist interpretation of the Hallel prayer, whose tone of joy and devotion is genuinely moving. Its author appears as a pure and sincere spirit, and his joyful affirmation of the redemption and deliverance of his soul is clearly heartfelt. Like most Western Sabbateans, he may never have encountered Frank personally, whereas the author of the prophecy of Isaiah, who did meet him, still regarded him as the incarnation of the living God, the true Jacob who does not die, and maintained this sense of salvation throughout his life. Across all these documents, the Frankist myth has lost much of its earlier radical intensity. Its elements remain recognizable, often reinterpreted as profound mysteries reserved for the discerning, yet they have undergone substantial modification. In many passages, Frank's insistence that the believers must literally become soldiers is so thoroughly allegorized that both its internal logic and its paradoxical force are diminished. The most significant change, however, is that although the doctrine of strange acts persists and is still linked to the appearance of the Virgin or the Lady, all reference to any ethic of libertinism has entirely disappeared. Here radicalism has retreated from the moral sphere back into the historical one. Even if it is assumed that the authors of these texts took care not to disclose themselves fully in writing, an assumption supported by many of their cryptic hints, it is nevertheless clear that libertine conduct is no longer regarded as a binding religious duty. Instead, there is a growing tendency to interpret the strange acts of past religious heroes, especially biblical figures, since the Bible remained authoritative for both believers and orthodox alike. Yet even here the emphasis shifts toward theoretical justification rather than practical imitation. In Offenbach, it is true, certain scandalous actions continued to be performed even on the Day of Atonement itself, but these had already become mere formal gestures, while among the believers themselves such practices were no longer genuinely maintained in good faith. Likewise, the mystical idea of the conjunction of masculine and feminine principles within the divine worlds, so central to earlier unorthodox Kabbalistic thought among nihilists and radicals, was, according to the available sources, now significantly softened. Overall, although the violation of the Torah of Beriah remained a central principle of the Holy Faith, its application was increasingly redirected toward other spheres, especially toward visions of a universal revolution that would erase the past in a single act so that a new world might be constructed. Toward the end of Frank's life, the hope of abolishing all laws and conventions acquired a concrete historical dimension. With the outbreak of the French Revolution, Sabbatean and Frankist subversion of traditional morality and religion was suddenly placed within a new and immediate context. It is even possible that this was not purely abstract, since Frank's nephews, whether as believers or for other reasons, were active in revolutionary circles in Paris and Strasbourg. The revolution appeared to confirm, in a striking way, the supposed correctness of the nihilist outlook. The foundations of the world seemed to be shaking, and the old order appeared on the verge of collapse. For the believers, this carried a dual meaning. On the one hand, in the characteristic self-referential manner of a spiritual sect, they interpreted it as a sign of divine favor, since the general upheaval allowed their inner renewal and hidden activities to proceed with less risk of exposure. This interpretation was expressed by Frank himself and repeated among his followers in Prague. At the same time, the revolution was also valued for its practical effect, the weakening of all religious and secular authorities, above all the power of the clergy. The believers in the Austrian ghettos, who combined admiration for certain Christian doctrines, such as the incarnation, with hostility toward its priests and institutions, were especially receptive to this aspect. In this context, contemporary anti-clerical sentiment found a ready echo among them. The Frankist author of the prophecy of Isaiah describes in enthusiastic detail the coming apocalyptic transformation, which is said to occur so that the Jewish people may be renewed, reject its rabbis and false leaders, and accept the faith of the true Jacob, as befits the people of the God of Jacob. Similarly, for the Prague commentator on the Hallel prayer, the verse, "The right hand of the Lord is exalted," from Psalm 118 meant that when the right hand of the Lord rises, the deceitful left hand of Esau, together with his priests and his deceitful sword, will withdraw, an allusion to the combined authority of secular and ecclesiastical powers. Across this literature, apocalyptic expectations blend freely with the political ideas of the revolution, which itself aimed at a form of political and spiritual liberation, to use the striking and often overlooked phrase with which the Frankists in Prague had already defined the purpose of their movement. All of this culminated in the remarkable case of the Red Epistle of the year 1799, a circular letter written in red ink and sent by the Frankists in Offenbach, regarded as the last center of the sect, to numerous Jewish congregations, urging them to accept the holy religion of Edom. The theoretical section of this document, forming approximately its final third, is especially significant. In a condensed form, the authors present their doctrine without any explicit reference to Christianity, since the term Edom, as previously noted, carries a coded meaning within their vocabulary. Alongside elements of the Frankist myth, the letter also incorporates familiar Sabbatean homiletic material, especially daring interpretations of biblical narratives, midrashic and Aggadic traditions, passages from the Zohar, and other Kabbalistic writings. In essence, it presents a complete mystical theory of revolution. The following passage illustrates the intellectual style, structure, and cryptic expression typical of this Frankist literature. It declares that it is time for the Lord to act, for they have made void thy law, and recalls the rabbinic teaching that the Messiah will not come until the kingdom is entirely given over to heresy. Interpreted mystically through the verse, it is all turned white, and then he is clean. With additional explanation drawn from Zror Hamor, that even the servants are thereby purified. It is argued that the time has arrived for Jacob, who once promised, I will come unto my Lord unto Seir, although this journey has not yet been completed. This Jacob is identified as their holy Lord Jacob, the most perfect of all, and the most excellent of the patriarchs, who unites opposing sides and binds extremes together until the final boundary is reached. Although last in sequence, the figure who is to arise on earth and proclaim, Arise, O Virgin of Israel, is declared not to be least in rank, but rather greater than the first Jacob. He is not dead but continues to guide the true path of the holy religion of Edom, so that all descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are called to follow this way. The patriarchs themselves are presented as having indicated the path for their descendants at the end of days. Abraham through his descent into Egypt, Isaac through his journey toward Abimelech, and Jacob, the most perfect of the patriarchs, through his departure from Beersheba to Haran, understood as leaving the faith of his fathers and entering a realm of impurity, as explained in the Zohar, where redemption is sought in the most corrupt domain. It is further described how Jacob came to the mouth of the well, encountered Rachel, rolled away the stone, approached Laban, served him within the realm of evil, and drew out his portion, later proceeding toward Esau. Yet his task remained incomplete, for although the stone was removed it was replaced again, and thus he could not proceed to Seir, the place without law. All of this is interpreted as preparation for the final Jacob, identified with Frank, who will complete the mission at the end of days. As the Zohar states, the first Jacob is perfect, but the last Jacob is perfect in all things and completes the work entirely. It is also alluded that a man will come in the form of Adam and a woman in the form of Eve who will outwit the serpent, and therefore the followers must continue along this path, since the ways of the Lord are right, and the just shall walk in them. Although there is a burden of silence, and the heart must not fully reveal what it knows, it is also written that guidance will come through unknown paths, making darkness light and rough places smooth. Jacob is further described as having honored his master, precisely through entering the realm of evil, as referenced in the Zohar. This is connected with the verses describing the Lord's emergence from Seir and his march from the field of Edom, as well as the question, who is this that comes from Edom? According to the Tana Eliyahu tradition, a time will come when the divine presence cannot be found in sea or abyss, but will be discovered in Edom itself. Those who follow this path and adhere to the house of Jacob, taking refuge under its shadow, are said to be granted union with the divine, as expressed in scriptural passages inviting ascent to the mountain of the Lord and the house of the God of Jacob, where divine instruction will be given. From there, the Lord will be sought and found, as it is written, emphasizing that from that very place light emerges out of darkness, and that even in darkness the Lord becomes a guiding light. The government officials who intercepted copies of this epistle correctly suspected its authors of being covert revolutionaries, though for the wrong reasons. The frequent obscure references to a figure named Jacob led them to assume that they were in fact dealing with the Jacobins, who were thought to be spreading radical propaganda among the Jews of the ghetto. An investigation was immediately ordered. However, the authorities in Frankfurt and Offenbach who carried it out did not look beyond the surface of the matter, and quickly concluded that it was nothing more than a scheme for deception and the extortion of money from unsuspecting Jews. A historian in the present era, who published the official report, rather naively remarks that the absurd theories of a Frankist conspiracy which had so alarmed the imperial officials were finally put to rest, without realizing that, on a deeper level, the suspicions of the authorities were in fact justified, even if unknowingly so. Had they examined not only the financial notes and debts of Frank's family in Offenbach, held by local bankers and moneylenders, but also the prophecy of Isaiah, written within the very confines of the court, they would have been astonished to discover how intensely these Frankist Jacobins longed for the overthrow of the existing order. The hopes and convictions of these late Sabbateans made them especially receptive to the millennial currents of their age. Even while they still remained believers, indeed, precisely because they were believers, they had already been moving toward the intellectual atmosphere of the Haskalah, so that when their faith finally faded, they re-emerged as leaders of Reform Judaism, secular intellectuals, or outright skeptics. It has already been shown how deeply Sabbatean indifference toward orthodox practice and Jewish tradition was rooted. Even the more moderate adherents tended to argue that the commandments were largely intended for observance only in the land of Israel, and that, in exile, there is no punishment for neglecting them, though there is still reward for observing them. This idea ultimately undermined traditional commitment and contributed significantly to the rise of assimilationist thought. A figure such as Jonas Welli, the spiritual leader and educator of the Sabbateans in Prague after 1790, exemplified this synthesis. He was equally appreciative of Moses Mendelssohn and Sabbatai Zevi, and the surviving fragments of his writings confirm the claim of one critic that he dressed the teachings of Kant in the garments of the Zohar and Lurianic Kabbalah. From the commentary on En Yuakov and the letters preserved by Peter Beer, it is evident that figures like Welli sought to harness the Haskalah for Sabbatean purposes, although in practice the Haskalah advanced on its own course and ended up making use of them instead. Even for those believers who remained loyal to their religious world and did not share the enthusiasm of the Prague-Frankists for the school of Mendelssohn, the transition toward the Haskalah proved relatively easy. It is no coincidence that a place such as Prosnitz, which had become a center of the Haskalah in Moravia in the generation following its spread, was also a stronghold of Sabbateanism in that region. The leaders of the school of Mendelssohn, who were neither Sabbateans nor influenced by mysticism or heretical thought, nevertheless found willing followers among Sabbatean circles, where the structures of rabbinic Judaism had already been internally dismantled, independent of secular critique. Those who had survived this internal collapse were now open to any alternative or new current. Having left behind their mad visions, they directed their energies and suppressed aspirations toward assimilation and the Haskalah, forces that achieved, without paradox and without religion, what the adherents of the accursed sect had once pursued with intense struggle within a turbulent world of paradoxical faith.